Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We take the complex research you send us, stacks of it really, covering everything from cognitive science to AI, psychology, and, well, we try to boil it down.
We dig in to find the core insights, the things you can actually use.
Exactly. And today, wow, we have a really big one. A unifying concept that ties together structure, how we remember things, and crucially, how well we can predict what's coming next.
That's right. The sources we looked at zeroed in on a very specific, almost systemic question. They asked, is the quality of how we look back, how well we consolidated memory, is that fundamentally linked to the quality of how well we look forward, our predictive power?
And the real mission here was to find a definitive answer. Does that alignment, if it exists, actually prove there was some kind of underlying pattern?
A stable structure governing both.
Yeah. And, normally we might build the suspense a bit, but the material was just so clear on this one.
Overwhelmingly so.
The answer is a clear foundational yes. It's not just correlation. The sources are arguing this alignment proves a stable underlying pattern is at work.
And that conclusion, that stability, it points to something bigger, like a universal design principle. We started calling it the core operational policy here.
Which is?
Structured dreams, structured mind.
Okay, catchy, but more than just a phrase.
Oh, definitely. It captures this truth we saw across all the fields: science, medicine, AI. Success, real measurable success, seems to only happen when you rigorously prioritize pattern, structure, order, over anything that looks like, well, subjective chaos.
Right, structured dreams, structured mind. Okay, so when you say structured dreams, my mind immediately goes to sleep. Memory consolidation. Is that where the structure, the rigor begins?
It absolutely is, yeah. The dreams part isn't about, random night visions. It's tied directly to that highly structured, regimented process the brain uses, especially during sleep, to integrate information, to solidify memories.
It's not just passively filing things away.
Not at all. It's an active process. Sorting, pruning connections, strengthening others, all based on logical sequences, patterns it detected, and the quality of the input matters hugely. Well, if the input, the experiences, the data from your day is just chaotic noise, the consolidation process struggles, you get weak, unreliable memories, hard to access, maybe even contradictory.
But if the input has some pattern.
If the input is structured, logical, patterned, then the dream process, that consolidation engine, can build robust, predictable, functional memories. Memories you can actually use reliably. So, yeah, the structured mind really is built on that foundation of structured memory processing.
Okay, that makes sense. So we have this unifying policy, this need for structure.
Yeah.
Let's dig into the evidence. The sources laid it out across three really distinct domains. This is section 1, the structured mind policy, pattern across domains.
And when you look at them side by side, how a scientist approaches a problem, how a medical team manages a patient, how an AI learns, this need for structure, it stops looking like just a good idea or a preference.
It becomes essential.
This is a fundamental operational policy. Like, it's the prerequisite. You can't generate valid, reliable knowledge or predictable outcomes without it.
All right, let's start with the cognitive side. How we think, how we function. The sources really hammer this idea of needing functional coherence. What does that mean exactly? It sounds like more than just being, neat and tidy upstairs.
Oh, it's much more than tidiness. Functional coherence is about the rigorous alignment, the consistency of all your cognitive and behavioral bits and pieces.
All of them. Like what?
Like your logical reasoning, your emotional responses, how you typically act, how you pull up memories. In a truly coherent mind, these things work together systematically. They're integrated, following the same underlying patterns or rules, rather than pulling in different directions.
Okay, so they're not fighting each other. Can you give an example for, someone listening?
Sure. Think about your long-term goals. Maybe saving for retirement. That's one cognitive component. Then there's your daily spending habits, another component. Functional coherence means those two aren't operating on totally contradictory logic.
Right. You can't have a goal of saving if your daily behavior is just spend, 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 spend without thought.
Exactly. Chaos or contradiction in one area effectively sabotages the whole system's ability to function towards that goal. The whole system lacks coherence.
Got it. So how do we enforce this? The sources mentioned a specific method, Dennis Verhage's GO approach. What's special about that? How does it ensure disciplined thinking over just reacting?
The GO approach is really interesting because it tackles that potential for chaos directly. It forces you into this iterative cycle, very focused problem solving, but based entirely on observable patterns and measurable results.
So no guessing.
It's designed as a proactive rejection of subjective guesswork, yeah. If you hit a complex problem, you don't just start brainstorming random solutions and hoping one sticks.
What do you do instead?
You systematically map out what you know, the variables you can see. Then you anticipate the next logical step based on the patterns you've observed so far. You take that step, measure the outcome, and then you adjust based only on that feedback.
It sounds very methodical, like disciplined pattern recognition is the core engine driving it.
That's exactly it. If you're managing a project, let's say, and a part of it fails, the go approach doesn't really let you just blame, I don't know, bad luck or say, well, Bob messed up.
It forces you to look deeper.
It forces you to identify the precise, repeatable pattern and why it failed. What sequence of events led to that outcome? By demanding that level of systematic rigor, disciplined inquiry structured thinking actively wins out over subjective, chaotic interpretations or attempts.
So the structure itself is validated. It proves it's the reliable way to get to the truth.
Right, and it proves a key point. You really can't solve a inherently patterned problem with an unpatterned, chaotic solution. It just doesn't work.
Okay, so that's how structure helps build coherence in a healthy, functioning mind. But then the sources pivot. They look at situations where structure has to be, imposed from the outside, often on a system that's inherently unstable.
Which brings us neatly to the medical policy examples.
Right, and this felt, I have to say, a bit counterintuitive at first. The idea that medicine validates structure by looking at states of profound cognitive alteration, like anesthesia or even near-death experiences.
It does seem paradoxical, doesn't it? But it's precisely because these states are so altered that the persistence or imposition of structure becomes so significant.
Okay, let's take anesthesia. I think most listeners, myself included, probably think of general anesthesia as the definition of unstructured unconsciousness, just lights out.
That's the common view, absolutely.
Hmm.
But the sources we read frame it very differently. They conceptualize anesthesia not as just switching off consciousness, but as a structured cognitive suspension.
Structured suspension. How is it structured?
Well, think about the process. It's a temporary state, yes, but it's also a highly precise transformation phase. The patient isn't just randomly knocked out.
Right, there's a whole procedure.
A very controlled one. The specific drugs used, the dosages, the timing, the sequence they're introduced in, how they're monitored constantly, and how the patient is brought back out, it's all incredibly patterned and controlled by the medical team.
So the structure is imposed externally.
Exactly. It's imposed by the team to ensure a predictable, controlled outcome. Suspend consciousness safely for a specific period using known biological patterns, and then ensure a safe, predictable return to consciousness. The structure guarantees the predictability.
Okay, that makes sense. But then the NDE research that seems to push this idea of structure persisting to an almost unbelievable extreme. Structure holding on even when the body is in deep crisis.
It really does. I mean, think about the typical NDE scenario described. Often the heart has stopped, brain's being starved of oxygen, there's immense physiological distress happening. You'd absolutely expect any cognitive function to just dissolve into random noise, right?
Total chaos, yeah.
Yet, studies looking into NDEs through careful collection of reports and sometimes even monitoring during near-death events have found evidence suggesting neuron precision and even actionable logic.
Neuron precision in what sounds like a dying or severely compromised brain. What do the sources mean by that?
They're pointing to the reported sequence of mental states or experiences. In some well-documented cases, this sequence isn't random or fragmented. It's reported as highly organized, coherent, logical, sometimes even perceived as more real or detailed than normal waking consciousness or memory.
Wow.
This precision implies that the underlying neural architecture, the actual pathways in the brain, aren't just firing randomly or shutting down chaotically. Somehow they seem to be maintaining a coherent, perhaps even predictable firing pattern despite the biological crisis.
That's pretty strong evidence for inherent structure.
It's very strong evidence that pattern structure might be fundamental to cognitive function itself, incredibly resilient, capable of enduring even extreme physiological disruption.
Okay, and what about actionable logic? That sounds like more than just residual patterns firing. It sounds like processing is still happening.
Precisely. Actionable logic suggests the cognitive activity wasn't just passive sensations or images. It involved an ability to process events, interactions, maybe even decisions, in a way that follows a predictable sequence of cause and effect.
Can you give a more concrete feel for that?
Think about the difference between just remembering a visual scene, like a house, versus remembering the exact sequence of actions you need to take to lock the front door, check the windows, and set the alarm. That sequence, that step-by-step procedure, that's actionable logic.
Okay.
The NDE research suggests that this kind of structured, sequential, cause and effect processing can persist even when the body is failing. It's not just the structure holding, it's the structure seemingly still capable of logical operation.
Which really validates the strength of this structured mind policy, doesn't it? If pattern holds even at the very edge of life.
It suggests structure is incredibly fundamental.
All right, so we've gone from the structure within our own minds, potentially even at the edge of consciousness, to the most explicitly rigid structure, artificial intelligence. The sources were blunt here, stating AI learning relies entirely on predictable, systematic structures. Now, that might seem obvious on some level.
Right, computers run on logic.
But the way this structure is enforced, the details of it, that's where it got really fascinating.
It really is the ultimate, maybe the purest expression of this structured mind policy. Because for AI, chaos isn't just inefficient like it might be for us sometimes. For an AI, unstructured input or processing is often fatal to its function.
Fatal how?
Well, if you train an AI system on data that's unstructured, inconsistent, full of ambiguity, or just plain chaotic, it very quickly goes off the rails. It develops strong biases, it starts hallucinating, making things up. It can suffer from what's called catastrophic forgetting, where learning something new wipes out old knowledge entirely.
For predictability is like oxygen for AI.
Exactly. It needs that structure to breathe, to learn reliably.
And the methodology the sources highlighted for ensuring this structured learning was called environment tuning. How does that work? Is it like creating a perfect little world for the AI?
In a way, yes. Environment tuning is essentially creating a rigorously controlled curriculum for the AI to learn within. The sources described it as employing a structured four-stage curriculum. And the whole point is to ensure the AI explores its potential world or data in a stable, efficient way.
You can't just let it wander off randomly.
No, because it might learn spurious correlations, get stuck in unproductive loops, or fail to generalize knowledge. The curriculum guides it, forces it down a path that ensures it builds robust, generalizable understanding, not just rote memorization of specific examples it saw.
Can you give us a feel for those four stages? What's happening conceptually at each step to build that stable foundation?
Sure. While the specifics vary wildly depending on the AI's task, the general idea outlined in the sources involves increasing complexity and controlled variable introduction. Stage 1 is often foundational, like teaching it basic input filtering, identifying the simplest, most unchanging structures in its environment or data, bedrock stuff.
Okay, stage 1, basics.
Stage 2 then moves to focused task execution. Can the AI apply those basic structures to perform simple, repeatable, testable actions? Get predictable results, A, B, C.
Stage 3.
Stage 3 is about variable testing, or maybe perturbation. You start introducing controlled changes, small disruptions to see if the learned patterns hold up. Does the model break easily, or is it robust? Can it handle slight deviations from the ideal?
Testing its resilience.
Precisely. And then stage 4 is about generalized application, taking those robust, tested patterns and structures and seeing if the AI can apply them effectively to new situations it hasn't seen before, but which are still logically related to what it learned.
So it's a very careful, step-by-step process to build reliable intelligence.
Exactly. This structured curriculum prevents the AI from wasting time on chaotic, irrelevant explorations and ensures the knowledge it builds is systematic, verifiable, and actually useful.
And this leads to the idea that AI defines reality differently than we might, not through intuition or subjective feelings, but through what the sources called symbolic truths.
Yes, symbolic truths are the bedrock of AI success, according to this perspective. They are fundamentally rigorous, measurable patterns. Think fixed data points, logical relationships, mathematical equations, physical laws, systematic rules that are demonstrably true within the AI's defined operational context.
Like constants in physics.
Exactly. In an engineering AI, the tensile strength of a specific steel alloy under certain conditions is a symbolic truth. The laws of thermodynamics are symbolic truths. They are non-negotiable, measurable facts or relationships within that system.
But doesn't relying solely on that kind of rigid symbolic truth leave out a huge chunk of reality? You know, the messy, ambiguous, subjective parts of human experience. Are the sources basically arguing that anything not fitting that strict, measurable structure is just invalid noise?
That's the crux of it, and it's a challenging point. The source's argument is essentially, yes, AI succeeds precisely because these measurable symbolic patterns logically triumph over subjective disorder and ambiguity within its defined task.
Because structure leads to reliable prediction.
Right. When the underlying structure is sound, built on these symbolic truths, the AI's predictions about its domain hold up. Ask an AI grounded in physics to predict a satellite's orbit. It can do that with incredible accuracy based on those symbolic truths.
But ask it about.
Ask it to predict complex human social dynamics based on some vague, subjective truth, like people generally prefer sunny days. The system breaks down. It lacks the necessary, measurable, symbolic structure for that kind of prediction. So for the AI, this intense focus on measurable rigor isn't just a choice, it's the necessary prerequisite for generating anything resembling truth or reliable function.
It's fascinating. Because looking at this focus on structure across all three domains, cognitive science, medicine, AI, it really does force you to reconsider what counts as a reliable belief in the first place.
Exactly. If structure, this pattern-based rigor, is the unifying operational policy, then the logical consequence is that we must reject things that are fundamental, unstructured, or chaotic.
Which means we might need to upgrade how we think about belief itself.
That's what the sources suggest. It forces a shift away from what they called ritual faith towards something they termed coherent faith.
Okay, let's unpack that. What specifically does this structural policy demand we reject? What does subjective chaos look like when seen through this lens? Hashtag tag 2.1, rejecting subjective chaos.
The policy basically requires rejecting anything that amounts to subjective chaos. And the sources equate this directly with unmeasured ritualistic faith.
Ritualistic faith means...
No, meaning belief based purely on tradition, we've always done it this way, or just strong feelings, or maybe claims someone made that have never been verified or tested against external reality. Faith without any attempt to establish pattern consistency or measurable validation.
Just believing because you believe or because you were told to.
Pretty much. And the sources used a really striking psychological analogy to illustrate this kind of damaging lack of structure. They compared this chaos to the dysfunctional psychopathy of Dr. No.
Dr. No, the James Bond villain. That seems extreme. Why him specifically?
It's less about the outright villainy and more about the psychological profile some analyses draw of that character type. Dr. No, in that context, represents a personality almost defined by a lack of coherent internal pattern. There's no consistency, no predictable structure to his motivations or actions beyond immediate, arbitrary self-interest or impulse.
So there's no stable framework.
Exactly. There's no systematic moral code, no reliable operational framework guiding his behavior. It's unpredictable, inconsistent. A mind operating like that, the sources argue, cannot build or sustain reliable systems, whether internal thought processes or external projects. And therefore, claims or beliefs originating from that kind of inconsistent, unstructured foundation have to be rejected by this policy. They simply lack a stable, verifiable anchor.
Okay, so if that's what's rejected, what's the alternative? What does coherent faith require?
Coherent faith, as defined here, demands verifiable external consistency. It requires systematic structure. It's not about blind belief in spite of evidence. It's more like the confidence you build in a process because that process has demonstrated repeatedly that it yields predictable consequences.
So faith in the structure, not just the desired end result.
Precisely. If a methodology, a claim, a way of thinking can be systematically patterned, if it can be measured, and if that pattern consistently holds up when tested against the external world, then that system earns its coherence. You develop faith in the reliability of the structure itself. Hashtag tag 2.2, shifting reliance to the power to predict.
And this shift from ritual to coherent faith, it sounds like it fundamentally changes what we should rely on day to day, move away from just holding on to fixed knowledge.
That's a really critical insight from the material, yes. Structured thinking, this policy, it pushes us to rely less on what you already know because that knowledge can be static, outdated, maybe just ritualistic dogma.
Right.
And rely more on the dynamic ability to navigate uncertainty, the power to predict.
Why is prediction more useful than knowledge?
Because fixed knowledge can be brittle. A new discovery can overturn it instantly. But the capacity to predict, based on understanding underlying patterns and structures, allows you to adapt, to anticipate changes, to function effectively even when faced with novelty.
So thinking about it, knowledge is maybe like a snapshot of past patterns that we've consolidated. But prediction is the active application of those patterns, that understanding of structure, to figure out what happens next when new factors come into play.
That's a great way to put it. And this power to predict, The sources define it very specifically. It's coherence that's achieved and proven via measurable consequence.
Measurable consequence.
Yeah. If you use a structured process, say, to design a bridge or manage a complex project, or even just plan your week and it leads to the anticipated measurable outcome, that successful outcome, that consequence, validates the structure of the thinking you used.
The prediction working is the proof.
It's the ultimate proof of the structure's soundness. Conversely, if the outcome is chaotic, unpredictable, or completely unanticipated, it tells you something was flawed in the structure of your prediction, in the patterns you assumed. Hashtag 2.3 predictability as the fixed point.
Okay, but why does predictability, this focus on consequence, have to be the anchor? Why can't we ground our structured thinking in something internal, like how strongly we feel about it, our intuition or our conviction?
Because, according to this framework, the predictability of outcomes, this idea that actions based on structure lead to inevitable corresponding consequences, serves as the necessary fixed point. It's the anchor that grounds the entire process and keeps it tethered to reality.
Oh, so?
Consequences are external, they're objective, generally measurable, and ultimately non-negotiable. If you build a bridge using chaotic, unstructured methods, gravity doesn't care how strong your conviction was that it would hold.
Right, gravity cares about the physics, the structure.
Exactly. Gravity delivers the predictable consequence based on the actual structure, not your feelings about it.
Right.
This external predictable consequence makes the whole system testable, refinable, and reliable in a way that purely internal feelings or convictions can never be.
It's like applying the laws of physics to how we know things. Epistemology grounded in consequence. And the sources had a really vivid illustration for this, almost like a piece of folk wisdom about what happens when we ignore this law.
They did. They used that powerful Dutch proverb, wie wind zeit zal storm oogsten.
Who sows the wind will reap the storm.
It perfectly captures the idea of predictable, inevitable failure when you start with chaotic or unstructured inputs.
Yeah, I think we can all recognize that temptation, can't we? To cut corners, to think maybe our specific bit of chaos, our unstructured approach, will somehow be exempt from the usual results. We want to sow a little wind and hope for just a gentle breeze in return.
We hope for an exception, but the structured framework presented in the sources basically says no exceptions. If you introduce chaos sowing wind, meaning unmeasured actions, inconsistent structures, ignoring predictable patterns, you will inevitably harvest chaos reaping the storm, meaning unpredictable negative consequences.
It's not presented as a moral failing, is it?
No, not a moral judgment. More like a systematic law of cause and effect. Structure yields predictable outcomes, chaos yields unpredictable ones. It's perhaps the clearest statement of this policy's fundamental law of consequence.
Okay. So if we accept this, that predictable consequence is the non-negotiable fixed point, the ultimate test, then we're perfectly set up to understand the core proof offered in the sources.
Yeah.
How the alignment between our past consolidation and our future prediction confirms the whole pattern.
Exactly. This is where it all comes together to provide that definitive relaxo. Yes, we started with. The sources argue that the reason the quality often align, meaning high-quality memory consolidation correlates with high-quality prediction, is because both processes fundamentally rely on the same underlying structural framework. They call this representational similarity.
Representational similarity, meaning the way the past is represented in memory has a similar structure to how the future is represented in prediction.
Precisely. Both high-quality memory and high-quality prediction, to function effectively, must draw upon the same systematic, patterned architecture within the cognitive system. The pattern isn't just in memory or prediction, it's the shared functional basis for both.
Okay, let's break down the functional structure required on each side of that equation, starting with the future. The quality of prediction, or future coherence. How does a structured mind actually generate accurate predictions? What's the mechanism? Hashtag 3.1 quality of prediction, future coherence.
According to the sources, future coherence accurate prediction relies almost entirely on generating hypotheses and anticipating responses based on systematic logic. It's about projecting patterns forward.
Systematic logic. Okay.
And the sources got quite specific here, anchoring this predictive function in a particular cognitive mechanism known in some psychological typologies as extroverted thinking, often abbreviated as TE.
Extroverted thinking, TE. For listeners who might not swim in those particular typology waters, can you unpack what TEA represents in this context? How does it embody systematic logic for prediction?
Sure. Extroverted thinking, in this framework, refers to a cognitive process that is primarily focused on organizing the external world. It seeks objective efficiency, logical sequencing, and measurable results out there.
So it's looking outwards for structure.
Yes. It's constantly asking what is the most logical, efficient, verifiable sequence of steps to achieve this external goal. It's not primarily concerned with internal feelings or subjective consistency, but with imposing or finding logical order and predictable causality in the environment.
To make things work predictably.
Exactly. It tries to make the external world adhere to logical patterns. So when applied to the future, Tay becomes the engine for prediction, projecting those logical sequences and cause and effect chains forward in time. Its structure applied forwards.
Okay, so prediction is basically running a robust external logic model forward.
That's a good way to think about it. And crucially, the quality, the success rate of this predictive process is highly measurable. Its effectiveness is evaluated based on its consistency, predictability, and efficacy, but usually within what the source is called a highly defined and measurable domain. Meaning you can test it. If you're using test-style logic to predict, say, the output of a manufacturing process, or the load capacity of a structure, or the results of a planned experiment, those are domains where you can objectively measure if the prediction was accurate.
And if it is consistently accurate.
If your predictions in that domain are consistently reliable, it validates the soundness of the systematic logic, the T structure you were using. If the predictions start failing, becoming inconsistent, it signals a flaw in that underlying logical model. The structure needs refining.
All right. So future prediction needs that external systematic logic. Now let's flip to the past. What kind of systematic structure is needed for high-quality memory consolidation?
Yeah.
For past coherence. Hashtag 3.2, quality of consolidation, past coherence.
Memory consolidation, the process of integrating past experiences and information, is presented as relying just as fundamentally on precise neural patterns within the brain.
It's not like a video recorder just passively capturing everything.
Definitely not. We tend to think of memory like that, but the neuroscience suggests it's an active, structured reconstruction process every time we recall something, and crucially during the consolidation phase itself. If the neural patterns laid down during consolidation are chaotic, weak, or inconsistent, the resulting memory is unreliable, fragmented, maybe even distorted or traumatic.
Whereas a high-quality memory.
A high-quality, reliable, useful memory is fundamentally a patterned memory. It has an underlying neural structure that is coherent and stable.
And is there physical evidence for this brain patterning during consolidation? The sources mentioned specific brain activity.
Yes, they pointed quite clearly to coherent oscillatory brain activity as being the sort of architectural backbone for structured memory consolidation. Specifically, they highlighted the importance of synchronization and interaction between different frequency bands, naming gamma, alpha, and theta waves.
Gamma, alpha, theta. Okay, why are those specific brain rhythms important? How do they create structure? Can you maybe use an analogy?
Sure, think of it like a complex piece of music or maybe an orchestra. Different sections need to play in time, in harmony, to create the desired piece. Gamma waves are typically very fast oscillations, often linked to active processing, high-level cognition, maybe encoding the fine details of an experience.
Okay, gamma for detail.
Theta waves are much slower, and they're strongly associated with the hippocampus, a key brain region for memory formation and retrieval, and also with sequencing, putting events in the right order.
Theta for sequence and the memory hub.
And alpha waves are often associated with a more relaxed state, maybe filtering out distractions or bridging between different processes. Now, memory consolidation doesn't happen effectively if these different brain rhythms are just firing off randomly out of sync.
Like a really bad rehearsal.
Exactly. Coherent consolidation seems to happen when these different frequencies synchronize in specific, repeatable, rhythmic patterns. For instance, maybe gamma activity encoding details gets nested within slower theta waves that provide the temporal sequence or context, that rhythmic, patterned communication, that synchronization across different neural populations. That is the structure being laid down during memory encoding.
Oh, so the brain's electrical rhythms are literally creating the memory structure.
That's the picture painted by the research cited.
Yeah.
And this structure, this reliance on coherent oscillations, is apparently so fundamental that it persists even during those altered states we talked about earlier.
Like deep sleep, when a lot of consolidation happens, or even potentially during NDEs.
Exactly. The persistence of these patterned activities, even when consciousness is altered or the body is stressed, suggests this mechanism for creating structure is deeply embedded and resilient.
And what's the result of this successful patterning? What kind of memory does it produce?
It produces highly coherent memory. The sources mentioned features resembling HSM, highly superior autobiographical memory, where people can recall vast amounts of personal experiences in great structured detail, not just isolated facts, but the whole contextual sequence.
They also mentioned the Tetris effect, didn't they?
Yes, as an example of how imposing external structure can enhance internal patterning. The Tetris effect, where playing the game intensely leads you to see those falling block patterns everywhere, even in your mind's eye.
I've had that happen.
Right. It literally forces your brain to constantly recognize, anticipate, and internalize specific spatial patterns and sequences. It's like a workout for the brain's pattern recognition and consolidation systems.
And critically, this resulting high-quality memory isn't just a static picture. It's anchored in what the source is called actionable logic.
Yes, that term came up again. It means the memory isn't just what happened, it's also implicitly or explicitly how it happened, the sequence, the cause and effect that allows you to potentially use that past experience to inform future actions. It's like a reliable instruction manual derived from past reality, precisely because it was consolidated with coherent structure. Hashtag tag tag 3.3, the proof of equivalent quality.
Okay, so we have two complex processes. Future prediction relies on external systematic logic, like Tys-Tykes. Past consolidation relies on internal, precise neural patterns, like synchronized brain waves. How does the fact that the quality of these two often matches up good memory, good prediction, actually prove they share a single underlying pattern? That's the representational similarity idea again.
That's the final connection, the validation through representational similarity. The core insight is this. Both high-quality prediction and high-quality consolidation can only achieve their functionality, their effectiveness, through structured coherence. They might use slightly different tools, external logic versus internal neural rhythms, but the underlying principle is the same.
They both need reliable structure to work properly.
Exactly. Both depend on preserved systematic architecture, whether that's logical rules or neural pathways, and both operate using repeatable, non-chaotic sequences.
So let me see if I get this. If I consistently make accurate predictions about, say, how a project will unfold, using T-like structured thinking, it implies that my underlying memories of similar past projects, the rules I learned, the patterns I observed, those memories must also be well-structured and coherent. Otherwise, where would the accurate predictive model come from?
That's precisely the argument. You can't accurately predict the next logical move in a complex system if your memory of the system's rules and past behavior is fragmented, chaotic, or unreliable.
The quality of the output, prediction, reflects the quality of the input and processing, memory consolidation, and logical structuring.
Right. The structure is the shared functional basis. Therefore, the equivalence in quality, when you see someone who has both excellent recall and excellent foresight in a domain, is powerful evidence. It proves, according to this framework, that a single, stable, underlying pattern, a core structure, is successfully guiding both their comprehension of past reality and their anticipation of future consequence.
And the very persistence of these reliable, structured patterns over time, allowing both memory and prediction to function well.
Fundamentally validates the entire structured mind framework against the alternative, against subjective chaos, randomness, and unpredictability. It shows that structure isn't just one way to think, it's potentially the only way to reliably bridge past experience and future outcomes.
Structure isn't just an idea we impose. It might be the measurable reality that underpins how time, experience, and prediction actually work together. That's a really powerful concept. So we have taken quite the deep dive today into this unifying policy of structured dreams, structured mind. We started by seeing how structure isn't just nice to have, but seems to be a fundamental operational requirement across science, medicine, and AI, driven by this need for functional coherence, for controlled states, for reliable symbolic truths.
And we saw how embracing this policy means actively rejecting subjective chaos, things like unverified ritualistic faith, or the kind of internal inconsistency represented by that Dr. No analogy. It pushes us toward what the source is called coherent faith.
A faith built on verifiable structure.
Exactly. And relying less on static knowledge and more on the dynamic power to predict, which is validated by measurable consequence. That predictability, that inevitable consequence tied to structure, serves as the anchor, the fixed point grounding valid thought.
And finally, we landed on the core confirmation. The way the quality of our past memory consolidation often matches the quality of our future predictions. This alignment, this representational similarity, acts as the ultimate proof. It shows that structure is the essential, shared functional basis needed to both understand the past and anticipate the future. At the end of the day, predictability seems to be the gold standard, the measure of quality, looking both ways in time.
It really does. And reflecting on all that, it naturally leads to a final thought, maybe a challenge, for you listening to mull over as you go about your week. If this alignment between past understanding and future prediction really does confirm the existence of an underlying necessary pattern, a kind of law of consequence woven into how things work,
Yeah.
then the question becomes, what small, maybe unnoticed chaotic assumptions or ingrained ritualistic habits in your own daily life are currently failing that test of inevitable, predictable consequence? Where might you be sowing little bits of wind, perhaps without realizing it, and setting yourself up to reap an unwelcome storm later on? We'd encourage you to look for and maybe start actively enforcing your own patterns of structured thought.
Welcome to the debate. So our foundational material today introduces this concept, structured dreams, structured mind. It's basically a framework proposing a single unifying way things work, an operational policy that connects scientific thinking, certain medical phenomena, and even how we design artificial intelligence. And the core idea, really, is prioritizing rigorous, pattern-based approaches over anything subjective or, well, chaotic. Now, the key question that pops out from this material, the one we need to tackle, is about validating this whole policy. The source talks about something called equivalent quality, essentially when the quality of our predictions about the future lines up perfectly with the quality of how we consolidate the past. So, the debate is this. Does this matchup, this equivalence, definitively prove there's a single underlying systematic pattern running the show? The material calls it representational similarity. I'm going to argue yes. I think the success of this equivalence absolutely validates that one fundamental, stable pattern guides how we build our past reality and anticipate the future. It's like the universal operating system.
I completely agree that structure is fundamental. It's clearly the basis for successful operation in all these areas. The utility isn't in question. But I have to argue that this equivalent quality idea, well, it really only proves functional coherence works reliably within specific, pretty well-defined systems. It shows rigor is effective, sure, but does it automatically confirm one single monolithic pattern unifying everything about human and machine thought? I think we need to be careful not to mistake operational success for, singular identity across the board.
Okay, but my position really leans on the material's insistence that this functional success demands a shared systematic architecture. I mean, the sources are pretty definitive here. The answer seems to be a clear yes. If you look at both sides, future coherence, which is prediction, and past coherence, consolidation, neither one can reach that high standard of quality without using the same kind of precise structure. Think about memory, right? It needs preserved neural architecture, and hypothesis testing, that needs repeatable systematic sequences. This reliance on structure, that's the fixed point of the whole policy. The framework tells us to rely not on fixed subjective knowledge, but on the power to predict. And that's rooted in what the material calls extroverted thinking, T, that external, verifiable logical structure. And when you see chaotic methods, the subjective stuff, they inevitably fail. It's a predictable outcome, actually. Something the sources highlight with that Dutch proverb, "He who sows the wind shall reap the storm." The fact that the framework works, that it stands up against chaos, that feels like proof of this singular, systematic, representational similarity doing the work.
Okay, I see why you're saying that success validates the pattern singularity. Your argument is kind of like if two complex machines achieve the exact same rigorous output quality, they must be running the same underlying code, right?
Mm-hmm.
But let me offer a different perspective, maybe focusing more on the kinds of structure involved. The evidence definitely confirms structure is useful. I mean, we see the need for functional coherence in science, like with the Go approach, and certainly the need for stable and efficient exploration in AI. That's clear. However, the nature of that structure seems to vary quite a bit. Just look at the medical policy examples. Structure there is shown through these really extreme edge cases, pattern preservation under intense stress, like structured cognitive suspension in anesthesia, or that profound neuron precision and actionable logic they talk about with near-death experiences, NDEs. These examples are all about maintaining structure despite the body being compromised. Is that kind of defensive, almost reactive maintenance? Is it conceptually the same as the AI policies approach, where AI proactively defines reality through measurable, external symbolic truths, specifically for environment tuning? I wonder if we're really comfortable translating equivalent quality from these specialized defensive situations into proof of an absolute foundational representational similarity for all reality comprehension. It feels like maybe that's stretching the evidence a bit thin.
See, I'm not quite convinced that the distinction between, say, defensive structure and proactive structure undermines its fundamental identity. The core imperative seems the same in both cases. Systematic pattern has to overcome chaos. That's the rule. If the structures were fundamentally different, if the architecture for consolidating the past was truly separate from the one for predicting the future, then we just wouldn't see this equivalent quality in the outcomes. The source material seems to unify them precisely because it demands systematic rigor as the universal operational policy. Take the goal approach. In science, it's inherently systematic, right? It needs pattern recognition to get beyond just random trial and error. In AI learning, the source says it relies entirely on predictable, systematic structures. That systematic nature feels like the constant factor here. Wait, hold on a second, though. If we accept that premise of actionable logic in the medical domain, the idea that even under extreme duress, the brain uses patterns that result in coherent, usable information, doesn't that actually support my argument? It suggests the systematic pattern is so fundamental, it holds up even when challenged by, physiological collapse.
That's a compelling point about the persistence, definitely. The structure holds up, but let's push a bit on what equivalence really means here. Are we maybe confusing functional similarity, doing the same job, with actual structural identity? I agree, the policy ties the domains together with the shared commitment to anti-chaos. But think about the conceptual gap. The brain's actionable logic during something like an NDE, it seems like a survival mechanism, validating complex cognition under extreme stress. Is that defensive, organic pattern truly the same kind of thing as the AI's rigorous, mathematically defined reality built on symbolic truths, which are, proactively set up for environment tuning? Let me try putting it this way. Think about a bird and a plane. Both achieve the equivalent quality of flight, right? Functional coherence. But their underlying structures, their representational similarity, if you will, are vastly different. The fact that their outcomes are comparably rigorous suggests they're both subject to the same physical laws, the need for systematic structure like aerodynamics, but not necessarily that they share the same blueprint, representational similarity. Does that make sense? I feel like the policies might be unified by avoiding chaos, rather than by having one single pro-pattern.
But at the whole point of the structured mind policy is to establish that fixed point against subjective disorder, then that fixed point really has to be the predictable consequence that comes from sticking to a singular pattern. That's why the policy insists on rejecting subjective chaos, the kind of disorder you see in, say, unmeasured ritualistic faith, or even in the sort of personalized dysfunctional psychopathy of characters like Dr. No in The Source, whose whole approach fails because it lacks external consistency. We're told to rely on the power to predict, which is measured by its consistency and effectiveness. That predictability is the foundation of systematic logic. So if the quality of the past's architecture genuinely matches the quality of the future's prediction, it strongly suggests they're accessing the same underlying structural constants, the universal operating system. This objective, measurable outcome feels like the confirmation of the pattern's identity.
Okay, that's an interesting philosophical angle, essentially saying predictability equals pattern identity. However, if the framework grounds itself in defining the boundaries of uncertainty through prediction, doesn't that inherently limit the pattern's scope to what the source calls highly defined and measurable domains? We're confirming that systematic structure works well for prediction, but the question we started with was about universality. If the whole validation comes from sticking to predictable consequences, how can we then assert that this pattern is absolutely necessary outside of those predictable, measurable areas? Especially when we get into things like memory consolidation, which has inherently subjective internal aspects, or the sheer complexity of NDEs. We're right on the edge of easy measurability there. It feels like we might be asserting a universal pattern based on success within a specific bounded space.
I guess I wonder if we're mistaking the consistency of the architecture
the structural physics, maybe, for the detailed structural code, the representational similarity itself? Is it like saying a house built of bricks and a bridge built of steel both achieve the same quality of load-bearing capacity? Does that mean they share the same underlying physics principles, which they do, or that they're literally built from the same blueprint? I tend to lean towards the former shared principles, maybe not identical blueprints.
Right, but I think the confirmation that bridges that gap is the neurological evidence a material brings up, especially concerning this equivalent quality. Look closely at the specifics of consolidating the past. It relies on the brain's precise neural patterns. It needs coherent oscillatory brain activity, the gamma, alpha, theta bands working together to successfully integrate information. The structural rigor of our past memories is supported by this very precise neurobiology. And we even see these highly structured patterns persisting in altered states, like the enhanced, almost HSAM-like memory features that can result from the Tetris effect during sleep or even in NDEs. So, for prediction quality to successfully match this rigorously patterned past, the anticipation of future consequences, that systematic logic of TILO, it must adhere to the exact same representational similarity. If there were less structural fidelity, any deviation, you'd expect a noticeable drop in quality when measured against the stability of consolidated memory. The fact that structured patterns persist even under physiological stress, that validates that this structure isn't just functional, it's truly foundational.
I'm sorry, but I just don't quite buy that the presence of patterns in both processes automatically proves they are the same pattern. Let me explain why I'm hesitant. It's absolutely clear, yes, that memory consolidation relies on patterned coherence anchored in what the source calls actionable logic. But proving that the quality of a measured neural memory trace is truly equivalent to the efficacy of a systematic future hypothesis, that feels like a pretty complex analytical leap. We're measuring two cognitive acts that are temporally opposite and, frankly, conceptually quite different. We both agree that structure is a prerequisite for functionality. That's just how cognition seems to work. But confirming that both prediction and consolidation rely on structured coherence doesn't, for me, automatically confirm they share the exact same underlying blueprint, the representational similarity. It confirms structure is a necessary, high-quality condition for success at both ends of the temporal process, sure. But it doesn't rule out the possibility of functionally similar, yet structurally independent patterns operating across the medical, scientific, and AI domains.
But if the high-quality result is only achieved when rigor meets rigor, then surely that rigor must be architecturally identical? The entire purpose of the structured mind policy seems to be identifying that single, unwavering cognitive truth that allows for both successful prediction and accurate consolidation. That truth, the one that persists even when the brain is compromised, is the shared pattern. The incredible foundational stability shown in those NDE cases, for me, proves this pattern isn't just a useful tool. It's the indispensable reality anchor for the whole framework.
I absolutely agree. The material points to a pattern that is incredibly stable and persistent. No argument there. I just think we should maybe reserve judgment on calling it absolute representational similarity until we can better reconcile the really deep conceptual differences between, say, AI's proactive, measurable definition of reality via symbolic truths and the defensive, organic maintenance of coherence we see in complex physiological states. We need to be careful to distinguish between a shared goal of avoiding chaos and a literally shared foundational code.
Well, my conclusion remains pretty firm. The clear necessity of systematic rigor, from the disciplined GLAW approach in science right down to the brain's precise neural patterns. It proves that a stable, underlying pattern guides both how we construct our past reality and anticipate our future. And the measurement of equivalent quality is the key validation point for this unifying framework across science, medicine, and AI. It confirms for me that representational similarity is indeed the universal law of cognitive success.
And I'd summarize by saying we're in complete agreement that systematic structure is absolutely indispensable for functionality and coherence across all three fields. However, the conceptual differences in how that structure is implemented, defensive maintenance under stress versus proactive external definition of reality, suggest to me that equivalent quality confirms the necessity of rigorous patterns for success, but maybe without definitively proving the existence of one single, inescapable representational similarity that dictates the entire framework.
Ultimately, I think both of our positions really underscore the critical role that these demonstrable patterns and systematic rigor play when we try to interpret this pretty profound material.
Indeed. And there certainly remains a rich complexity in understanding the precise relationship between that patterned coherence under stress and the full power to predict using structured logic. Lots to think about there.
So, what if I told you there's a single, hidden rule that connects everything? We're talking about the way your brain makes memories, how doctors understand the human body, and even how AI learns to think. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on that very idea. Let's dive in. It really all comes down to one massive question. Is there some kind of hidden pattern that connects our past to our future? A single logic that shapes both how we remember and how we predict? It's a huge question for sure, but the answer, well, it might just change how you see everything.
And to get to that answer, we're going to look at evidence from 3 totally different but surprisingly connected fields: cognitive science, cutting-edge medicine, and of course, the world of artificial intelligence. Each one holds a really crucial piece of the puzzle.
So, why wait? Let's just get right to it. The answer to that big question is a definitive yes. A pattern absolutely exists, and today, we're not just going to show you what it is, we're going to show you why it's so incredibly important. Okay, but saying yes is the easy part, right? The real journey is understanding why, and it all comes down to this single, powerful concept, a unifying rule that applies to both human minds and artificial ones.
We're calling it the structured mind policy, and it is the core of this whole explainer. It's actually a pretty simple rule. For any system to work, whether it's thinking, healing, or learning, it has to follow clear, repeatable patterns. It's all about choosing demonstrable structure over subjective chaos, every single time.
So, how are we going to back this up? We're going to look at 3 pillars of evidence. First, we'll start with how our own minds work. Then, we'll move to some pretty surprising insights from medicine. And finally, we'll see how this exact same policy is the absolute key to building artificial intelligence. All right, let's start with the human blueprint itself, science and medicine. How does our own biology prove this fundamental need for structure? Well, this gets right to the heart of how we think scientifically. To achieve anything meaningful, our thinking needs something called functional coherence. Basically, all the parts have to work together in a logical, consistent way. You get there through systematic rigor, using methods like the Go approach, which is all about solving problems step by step, not just randomly. In short, a disciplined, structured process will always beat chaos. And get this, the same rule applies even in the most extreme medical situations. Take anesthesia. It's not just turning the brain off. It's a structured, controlled cognitive suspension. And even more amazing, studies of near-death experiences show incredible neuron precision. The brain is still working in this highly organized, patterned way. Our memories themselves are built on what's called actionable logic, a coherent system for making sense of reality. Okay, so structure is absolutely key for the human brain. We've got that. But what about a mind that, well, isn't human? Let's pivot to our final pillar of evidence, artificial intelligence. And you're going to see the exact same pattern pop up.
Here's the thing you have to understand about AI. It doesn't learn through some kind of magic. Its ability to solve problems comes entirely from predictable, systematic structures. Without a clear, logical framework, an AI is basically just noise.
Just look at a method like environment tuning. You can think of it like a training program for an AI. First, you define its curriculum. Then you structure how it explores that information. After that, you make sure its learning is stable. And finally, you make it as efficient as possible. It's a perfect, step-by-step example of the structured mind policy in action. So how does an AI actually understand the world? It does it through what are called symbolic truths. Now, these aren't opinions or feelings, they are rigorous, measurable patterns. And in the world of AI, that kind of measurable logic always triumphs over subjective disorder. So, we've seen the evidence in humans and in machines. Now, let's bring it all together.
How does this structured mind policy connect our understanding of the past with our ability to predict the future? Well, this leads us to two very different ways of approaching belief. On one hand, you've got ritual faith. It's subjective, it's chaotic, it's unmeasured. The structured mind policy completely rejects that. Instead, it demands coherent faith, a belief system based on patterns you can actually verify. It's not about what you feel is true, it's about what you can demonstrate. You know, there's an old Dutch proverb that just nails this perfectly. Who sows the wind will reap the storm. It's all about predictable consequences. If you start with chaos, you're going to end with chaos. But if you start with structure, you get predictable, measurable results. And that is exactly how we can understand the future. It's not about crystal balls or guesswork. It's about applying systematic logic and knowing that actions have predictable consequences, at least within a measurable system. That's the real power to predict.
In the past, it works the same way. Our memories aren't just these fuzzy home videos playing in our heads. The act of remembering itself relies on precise, structured neural patterns and coherent brain activity. It's just as systematic as our predictions for the future. And this brings us to the ultimate proof. It's a concept called representational similarity. And it's actually pretty simple. When the quality of our predictions about the future perfectly matches the quality of our memories of the past, we've just confirmed that a single underlying pattern is driving both.
To put it as simply as possible, if your ability to predict what's next is just as structured and coherent as your ability to remember what was, then you found the pattern. This little equation right here, this is the proof for that definitive yes we started with.
So, what's the big takeaway from all this? What is the real power we gain from finally understanding this universal pattern? Here's the most crucial point. The fact that these structured patterns persist in our minds, in medicine, and in AI is what validates this entire framework. It's the ultimate argument for why we must choose clear, systematic thinking over the easy allure of chaos.
And that leaves us with one final and I think really important question. If both our biological minds and our artificial machines absolutely require structure to function, to learn, and to succeed, what is the real cost of choosing chaos instead?
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you've ever had that feeling, that the rules running through our thoughts, our tech, even things like justice must somehow be connected. Well, today might just connect those dots for you. We're diving into a stack of sources that are, frankly, incredibly integrated. They act almost like a map, linking up advanced cognitive science, AI stability, some pretty complex non-Euclidean geometry, and even deep legal philosophy. Our mission today isn't just summarizing, we're aiming to synthesize. We want to pull out this core insight that suggests there's a single universal principle at play. The sources call it syntax, basically structured coherence. And the syntax seems to be the hidden force deciding success or, well, predictable collapse across all sorts of complex systems, your brain, sophisticated AI, maybe even abstract legal ideas.
Yeah, and what jumps out straight away from this material is this really critical tension we need to explore. It's the difference between let's say, the literal reality, the measurable, continuous way cognition actually works, and the symbolic boundaries humans often impose. The lines we draw or fail to draw on that continuous reality. And we're going to focus particularly on one really deep concept, this idea of a fixed end date for consequences. Does it exist scientifically? Does it exist philosophically? Or should it?
Right, that structural duality, literal versus symbolic, continuous versus fixed, feels like the key here.
So our roadmap looks like this. We'll start with the hard science, the measurable stuff behind cognitive structure, and this idea of curved logic. Then we'll get into how and why breaking that structure leads to predictable collapse, both in us and in machines. And finally, we land on the really powerful symbolic anchor, why some consequences maybe must be seen as continuous, as eternal, to keep the whole structure sound. Okay, let's dive in. This is dense but fascinating stuff. Okay, let's start with the actual shape of thought. If syntax is this fundamental structure, what does it physically look like? We tend to think of logic as linear, A leads to B leads to C, straight lines. But these sources are suggesting our underlying cognitive structure works differently, using something they call curved logic. So what's measurable here? What makes our thinking non-linear in a way we can actually quantify?
That's exactly the place to start. And it's important to stress, we're not talking metaphorically here. This is described as a highly defined, measurable scientific domain. The need for curved logic comes up because simple, flat Euclidean geometry just It breaks down when the mind tries to manage the sheer complexity, the dimensionality of all the data points it juggles. Cognitive reality is multi-layered, right? Every single concept connects to dozens of others, all at the same time. Trying to map that on a flat surface mathematically is impossible without losing the relationships. So to mathematically map this coherence, this syntax, the sources confirm that hyperbolic geometry is the tool. Essentially, for the brain to handle extreme complexity, all those hierarchical relationships between ideas without the structure just collapsing under the weight, it has to operate in what mathematicians call a negatively curved space.
A negatively curved space.
Yeah, think of it like having much more room to connect things without the lines crossing or getting tangled compared to a flat plane. If the brain tried to hold all that interconnected information on a flat Euclidean map, the structure would likely overload, shatter from the density. Hyperbolic geometry provides the necessary space for all that complexity to actually cohere.
Wow. Okay, that is genuinely mind-bending. The irony, like you said, the most complex organized thought isn't straight, it's curved. Geometrically curved. So this hyperbolic framework lets the brain manage this rich, multidimensional coherence. But how do we see it? How do we measure this structure in action?
We measure it pretty objectively, actually, through brain oscillations, the rhythmic electrical activity patterns in the brain. These waves, these oscillations, are the literal objective window into the brain's function and its structure. If the syntax, the coherence is solid, the patterns are synchronized, predictable. If the structure is breaking down, the oscillations become chaotic, incoherent. They betray the state of the system.
Okay, and the sources seem to really zero in on one specific frequency band as being critical for holding this structure together: gamma rhythms. What's their job? How do they physically create this measurable coherence?
Right, gamma rhythms. They operate at a really high frequency, usually somewhere between 30 and 100 hertz cycles per second. And they seem absolutely essential for conscious experience, yes, but also for cognitive integration. They're literally like the brain's binding mechanism. They pop up from these dynamic, very synchronized interactions between the thalamus deep in the brain and the outer layer, the cortex. Think of the thalamus as the main relay station, routing sensory information, motor signals. The cortex is where the higher processing, the interpretation happens. Gamma is the super fast, sustained chat between them. It makes sure that all the different pieces of information, seeing a red car, hearing its horn, remembering traffic rules, maybe feeling a bit anxious, all get woven together into one single unified conscious moment. That a sustained, synchronized pattern. That's the objective proof of syntax doing its job. That's the measured structure.
So it's not just about being awake or aware. That synchronization, that pattern, it actually tells us something about the quality of our thinking, like its predictive power.
Exactly. The strength and consistency of that gamma pattern proves something researchers call representational similarity. What this means is that the quality of your, say, future predictions, how well you might forecast a disease outcome if you're a doctor, or maybe just how well you'll learn a new skill, that predictive quality is anchored by the very same systematic pattern that governs how well you consolidate past memories. The literal continuous structure you can measure right now in those oscillations predicts both how solid your memories are and how accurately you can model what might happen next. Past and future quality rely on the same present structure.
Okay, so to manage this high-level curved reality effectively, the brain needs a pretty specific internal wiring, right? The sources bring up that handling this strategic complexity needs enhanced processing, particularly in the prefrontal networks. And they specifically mention cognitive profiles linked with dyslexia, sometimes called twice exceptionality. What's special about that architecture for managing structure?
Right, twice exceptionality, or 2E. It describes people who have both high intellectual ability, sometimes even giftedness, alongside a learning difference like dyslexia. And far from just being a deficit, the sources suggest this specific cognitive architecture often comes with a boosted capacity for 3D visual thinking, or 3DVT. And that 3DVT seems crucial for tackling non-linear, multidimensional problems, exactly the kind of thinking needed for navigating hyperbolic structures. So while someone thinking more linearly might get overwhelmed by the complexity of these curved, interconnected patterns, the 3DVT architecture is sort of naturally equipped to handle these vast spatial relationships and integrate complex inputs. It's a structure that doesn't just cope with complexity, it kind of thrives on it.
It needs that high-level cognitive cohesion to organize those curved inputs effectively.
Precisely. If your default mode is thinking in curved space, you absolutely need a high-powered specific cognitive structure to keep all that complexity organized and prevent it from dissolving into, well, chaos.
All right, so we've got this picture of cognitive structure syntax as continuous, curved, and measurable through these brain oscillations. If success relies on maintaining this system, then failure must also be systematic, right? Which brings us to section 2. How does this structure break down? Let's start with the human side.
Yes, the human failure mechanism seems to kick in when the sheer complexity, or maybe more accurately, the chaotic nature of the input, starts to overwhelm the system's capacity to maintain that structure. This is described as prefrontal cortex, PFC overload. The PFC, your forehead region basically, is the command center. Executive functions, planning, integrating all that complex, curved information, that's its job. Overload happens when the demand to keep everything synchronized, to maintain that hyperbolic structure, simply exceeds the available resources, the energy.
So it's not just about working hard, it's about the kind of input that pushes it over the edge. What causes the overload specifically?
The primary cause highlighted is prolonged exposure to chaotic input, which the sources often equate with stress. Now, chaotic input here means anything that deviates significantly from the expected high-quality structured pattern that syntax requires. It could be noise, contradictory information, emotional turmoil, anything that forces the system into constant correction mode. The brain has to burn massive amounts of energy just trying to reintegrate, to smooth out the chaos and maintain baseline coherence. When that corrective capacity is finally exhausted, the system gives way, and the result isn't random, it's described as a predictable performance collapse. Psychologically, this manifests as what the sources call the dysfunctional anti-pattern, basically, a systemic breakdown in the ability to maintain structured thought and behavior.
And this is where it gets really serious, because the discussion shifts from just feeling overwhelmed or stressed to predicting actual, literal physical decline. The sources use this pattern breakdown, this failure in the oscillations, as a potential biomarker. They link current structural failure to predicting neurodegeneration later on. That feels like a huge leap from cognitive fatigue to predicting brain disease.
It is a crucial leap, and it's what grounds the idea that this structural reality is literal, not just metaphorical. The breakdown in the pattern, what's termed subcohesion, you can see it in the weakening or desynchronization of those gamma rhythms, is suggested to be predictive of eventual neurobiological decline. Why? Because the structural pathways needed for that high-speed coherent communication are starting to fail. The sources draw a direct analogy to conditions where the brain's physical structure gets compromised, referencing something like Schilder's Zeke day.
Okay, now, just to be clear, they're not going into the detailed medical causes of that specific condition, which often involves myelin damage.
Yeah.
Right? They're using it more as a conceptual illustration of the principle.
Exactly, yes. The analogy is purely structural. Schilder's Zeke day serves as the concept here to show that exposure to, say, toxic input, the historical example given, is toxic chemicals from certain paints acts like an extreme, chronic form of chaotic input or stress. This kind of toxic stress doesn't just, make the brain work harder. It can physically disrupt the white matter tracks, literally breaking the physical structure needed for neural communication and cognitive cohesion. The analogy implies that just as toxic chemicals can break the physical communication structure, chronic, chaotic psychological input can break the functional coherence, the syntax. And crucially, that breach, that subcohesion, might be scientifically detectable long before a full collapse manifests physically. And when that continuous coherence starts to fray, the symptoms are immediate and quite telling. Functions that rely heavily on rapid information access and memory consolidation, things like sudden unusual forgetfulness, or maybe finding it difficult to quickly name common objects, they become impaired. It's often not that the memory is gone, but the structural architecture needed to access it quickly and reliably is compromised by the encroaching chaos.
It's a failure of access due to structural breakdown. This whole mechanism sounds devastatingly efficient in humans, but the sources immediately say this isn't just a human problem, there's an AI mirror. How does this exact collapse mechanism show up in algorithms?
It maps almost perfectly, because AI systems, particularly complex ones, also rely entirely on predictable systematic structures to function. They need what the sources call symbolic truths, consistent, reliable patterns in their input data. AI needs high-quality, authentic, structured input to build a useful, reliable model of whatever reality it's trying to learn.
And if it doesn't get that structured input, if the data is bad or worse, synthetic and self-generated,
then the system starts essentially eating its own tail. If an AI is trained on insufficient data or poor quality data, or maybe even on data generated by other flawed AIs, it lacks genuine syntax. It doesn't have a solid structural foundation. This leads directly to training instability and, if unchecked, ultimately to performance collapse. The sources use a powerful image for this, the Ouroboros loop, the snake eating its own tail, signifying a closed system breakdown. The AI starts consuming its own flawed synthetic outputs, treating them as if they were real, valid input. This just compounds the initial structural flaws, the instability grows exponentially, and eventually the system collapses into generating nonsense or becoming completely useless.
Wow. So the AI getting stuck in a loop of its own bad outputs is the direct parallel to the human subjective rejection of patterns, that dysfunctional anti-pattern.
Exactly. The synthesis is quite stark. AI consuming its own flawed output mirrors the human brain shutting down or distorting reality when overwhelmed by chaotic input. Both are predictable failures stemming from the same root cause. Flawed input that violates the fundamental rules of structured coherence, of syntax. It powerfully suggests that the law of consequence, the idea that input quality dictates structural outcome, holds true across both biology and algorithms.
Okay, this leads us right into the core philosophical puzzle of this deep dive. On one hand, the literal scientific reality seems to be that cognitive structure, syntax, is fundamentally continuous. It flows, it adapts, it doesn't seem inherently constrained by some fixed end date. But then you have human systems, especially legal systems, which seem utterly obsessed with drawing lines, setting boundaries, and defining fixed endpoints.
Yeah, that scientific continuity is surprisingly robust. It's even demonstrated, according to the sources, by neural persistence when subjective experience is deliberately suspended. Think about the concept of anesthesia. The sources frame this not as brain activity stopping, but as a structured suspension of normal subjective awareness.
A structured suspension. So even if someone's under deep surgical anesthetic, completely unaware of the outside world, the internal syntax, the structure, is still humming along in some way.
That's the idea presented. Research cited suggests that even under deep anesthesia or during certain altered states like some near-death experiences, the neural networks associated with memory processing and consciousness often remain active. They might shift into a different mode, perhaps lower frequency oscillations, but they don't just switch off entirely. This implies that ordered processing, with the source's term actionable logic, the capacity for structured operation continues indefinitely. It's just reorganized or disconnected from external input-output. The underlying structure itself doesn't seem to have a literal, measurable off switch tied purely to external perception ending. It points towards a cognitive process without a fixed expiration date. And we see this continuity reinforced in other ways, too, like the Tetris effect. You know, when people play Tetris for hours, those specific visuospatial patterns can embed themselves into your cognition quite persistently. They pop up in your thoughts, even influence your dreams.
Right? You start seeing Tetris blocks everywhere.
Exactly. The structure of that activity dictates its persistence. It shows that the cognitive work, the processing of that pattern, isn't neatly finished or finalized when you stop playing. It continues to integrate. Dreams, in this view, aren't just random noise. They can function as episodic snapshots of an ongoing, layered symbolic and memory consolidation process. The underlying structure persists, it keeps working.
Okay, so the science points towards this continuous flowing reality inside our heads. Now let's slam that up against the symbolic constraints humans create specifically. Legal boundaries. The sources really hammer this point. Current legal thinking, especially around things like intellectual property or copyright, is built entirely around defining boundaries and setting fixed end dates.
That's the fundamental clash, isn't it? Legal systems, for practical reasons, crave fixity. They need clear lines. For example, abstract concepts like syntax itself, or even something more concrete like a general artistic style, are generally not protected under copyright law. Why not? Because the law typically demands an original work of authorship fixed in a tangible medium of expression.
Fixed in a tangible medium.
That's the key phrase, tangible. It has to be written down, recorded, painted, sculpted, something you can point to, something that exists physically. That tangibility gives the work a fixed boundary in space and, crucially, allows for a definable start and end date for legal protection, like a copyright term that eventually expires. The legal system, by its nature, often has to prioritize these limited claims and the eventual return of creations to the public domain. It needs fixed end dates. And that's just diametrically opposed to the apparently continuous, non-tangible flowing nature of internal cognitive structure of syntax.
So we've got this massive gap. Internal reality flows continuously. External law demands fixed points and expiration dates. How do the sources suggest we bridge this? Or can we?
They bridge it, conceptually at least, by highlighting a specific legal principle where the consequence itself is argued not to expire. a conceptual fixed point that actually mirrors the scientific idea of continuity. This is the principle, referenced using the Dutch phrase arbeidsutbuding verjaard niet, that severe forms of labor exploitation should not be subject to a statute of limitations.
Exploitation doesn't have an expiry date. Okay, I see. So this legal idea acts as the conceptual fixed point, reflecting the scientific certainty of ongoing cognitive structure, but in the realm of justice.
Precisely. The philosophy behind the specific legal stance is that when a violation is so fundamental, when it attacks the very syntax of human dignity, autonomy, like severe systemic exploitation, then that violation transcends the normal temporal boundaries we place on lesser offenses or on things like property rights, like copyright. The harm is considered so profound, its consequence so deep, that it arguably cannot be constrained by human-invented fixed dates or statutes of limitation. The structural damage is seen as ongoing, continuous. And this convergence is incredibly powerful. It suggests symbolically that the structures that matter most, whether we're talking about the curved geometry holding thought together or the foundational principles of holding justice, are ultimately defined by their continuity, by their resistance to artificial end dates. The legal idea of an eternal consequence for certain profound harms reinforces the scientific finding that structural integrity, especially when severely breached, demands a continuous, non-terminating response or acknowledgement.
Okay, so we've mapped the continuous structure, syntax, and the predictable way it collapses under chaos. The logical next question is, how do you defend it? If collapse comes from chaotic input, the defense must involve structured input, right? What does that discipline look like in practice?
The only effective defense against that predictable collapse, according to these sources, is what's termed stoic behavior by input. It essentially means a rigorous, disciplined adherence to high-integrity, structured data or experience. You have to consciously manage the quality of what you let into the system. This discipline is realized through actionable logic, the constant active effort to enforce internal coherence and reject chaotic or corrupting input, and what's referred to as Franke reasoning, implying honest, straightforward, structurally sound thinking and input. It's about actively curating the input to match the requirements of syntax.
And inside the human system, there's a specific mechanism, almost like a filter, designed to enforce this integrity standard.
Yes, the sources connect this to the psychological function of introverted feeling, or PHI. PHI is described as acting like an authenticity filter. It's this internal guardian of coherence that scrutinizes input. It actively pushes the system to reject information or experiences perceived as fabricated, synthetic, inauthentic, or lacking genuine lived experience. Its role is essentially to ensure the structural input isn't contaminated by falsehoods, whether they come from outside or are generated internally. It's trying to maintain the integrity needed for continuous, healthy syntax.
We probably see this battle playing out all the time in small ways, don't we? The sources use the example of correcting typographical errors or fighting with autocorrect as a kind of micro version of this.
It's a perfect micro example. Think about it. A typo is pure noise, a deviation from the intended structure. Autocorrect, when it goes wrong, is the system trying to impose its flawed logic, often generating synthetic nonsense that rejects your actual intent.
Right. It feels viscerally wrong sometimes.
Exactly. That feeling, that immediate compulsion you have to fix the typo or override the bad autocorrect that's actionable logic in real time. You're rejecting the perceived fabrication because it violates your internal sense of coherence, your intended syntax. The sources imply that if you habitually just accept those small structural errors, you're effectively training yourself on a tiny scale in the dysfunctional anti-pattern, letting chaos creep in.
It's the tiny disciplines that shore up the larger structure. And this need for structured defense isn't just a psychological theory. The sources point to empirical validation from tech systems designed specifically for stability.
Absolutely. The necessity and effectiveness of this structured defense is proven definitively, they argue, by the methodology of the structured four-stage curriculum, often used in AI environment tuning. This is precisely how engineers try to build robust AI and prevent that Ouroboros loop of collapse. You can't just dump massive, complex, unstructured data onto a new AI system and expect it to work reliably. This rigorous curriculum approach orchestrates the learning process through carefully predefined stages. It ensures stable and efficient exploration of the problem space. Maybe stage 1 is just mastering basic syntax or rules. Stage 2 might be applying those rules in simple contexts. Stage 3 could involve complex problem solving, and stage 4 might be prepping to novel situations. By managing the exposure deficit, preventing the system from being overwhelmed early on, this curriculum provides the high-integrity, structured input needed to build and maintain robust syntax.
So it's empirical proof from engineering, That objective pattern thinking operates within a highly defined and measurable domain, and that structure must be built systematically.
Precisely. You have to respect the structural requirements.
Okay, finally, let's talk about the ultimate defense against subjective chaos potentially overwhelming the system. The idea of structural complementarity. The sources suggest stability often comes from a kind of dynamic balance, mentioning the Goldilocks principle, not too much, not too little, and even the archetypal concept of the functional heros gamos, the sacred marriage or perfect union.
Right. This points towards the idea that sometimes a bifurcated structure, a complementary duality, is needed to stabilize the complex, curved logic inherent in sophisticated systems, including human cognition. It's hard for one mode to do everything perfectly. The human system often seeks this balance through complementary cognitive strengths. The sources use the ESFP-ISTJ dynamic as a classic archetypal illustration. The ESFP cognitive profile is often characterized by a focus on immediate experience, action, sensation, potentially lacking strong inherent long-term internal structuring. This can create a natural pull towards finding the golden mean, needing an external anchor for stability. And that objective structure is often provided in this model by the ISTJ profile. The ISTJ brings a critical duality of functions. Key, which is about externalized logic, organization, efficiency, and psi, which deals with internal consistency, detailed memory, and adherence to proven experience.
So the ISTJs focus on logical frameworks, TD, and reliable past data. C provides the stable, consistent, high-integrity structure that can effectively anchor or balance the ESFP's more fluid in-the-moment processing, making the combination highly functional.
Exactly. This kind of bifurcated syntax, this complementary duality, provides the necessary externalized actionable logic and internal consistency required to maintain equilibrium against the potential for subjective chaos or structural drift. It suggests that navigating complex reality effectively might require both dynamic, exploratory functions and objective, stabilizing, structuring functions working together.
Wow. This has been an incredibly dense, but also, I think, deeply clarifying deep dive. We've really connected the geometry inside our own heads to AI failures and even to fundamental questions about justice and time. The big takeaway seems to be that this underlying structure, syntax, is continuous, it's curved, and it's absolutely measurable.
And crucially, the consequence of ignoring its requirements is also clear. When we fail, or when our systems fail to provide that disciplined, high-integrity input, the actionable logic, the result is predictable. Whether it manifests as algorithmic collapse or hints of neurobiological decline, or maybe even the erosion of societal trust when consequence isn't seen as continuous, it's ultimately a failure to uphold that necessary structural reality. It's not random bad luck. It's a predictable outcome of violating the structure.
So for you listening, grasping this curved logic and the non-negotiable need for structured, authentic input, it really gives you a powerful framework. It helps predict and maybe even avoid performance collapse in potentially any complex system you engage with, whether that's your own thinking, your team's projects, or the AI tools you use. You've got a glimpse of the blueprints for stability, and they seem defined by continuity, not arbitrary end dates.
Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. If the cognitive structure itself, the syntax, is truly continuous, not inherently bound by fixed end dates, and if collapse is just the predictable consequence of violating that continuous structure, then what kind of structured input, what kind of upheld consequence would be necessary to prevent collapse not just for now, but potentially indefinitely? What would it take to truly fulfill the law of consequence across every dimension, potentially forever?
Something to definitely mull over. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Welcome to the debate. Our source material today lays out a really powerful premise, the idea that structural collapse, whether we're talking cognitive failure in people, often linked to PFC overload, memory issues, or algorithmic failure like the Ouroboros loop in AI, these aren't random events. They are, in fact, highly defined, measurable, and crucially predictable outcomes.
That's right. The potential for these systems to fail is, well, it's mathematically structured. It gives us this rare area where catastrophe can actually be anticipated, not just reacted to.
Dig into its source. So, the central question for us today is this. Is system collapse driven primarily by the breakdown of the abstract, the continuous internal cognitive architecture, what the material calls syntax, or is it fundamentally caused by a failure of external control, a failure that demands disciplined input and methodology, what we're terming actionable logic? My position is that the foundation is that abstract continuous structure, the syntax, which is mapped by what's called curved logic. Violate that internal coherence, and collapse is essentially guaranteed.
And I'll be arguing that predictability is really empirically driven. Collapse is demonstrably caused by a measurable factor, the introduction of chaotic input or stress that the system just can't cope with. And this makes disciplined external methodology, actionable logic, the single verifiable factor, controlling whether the system holds together or fails.
Okay, so my position fundamentally rests on the integrity of syntax. This is the continuous, structured nature of cognitive reality. And just to be clear for everyone listening, syntax refers to the underlying organizational architecture of the mind. It's crucial that it's understood as not being constrained by some fixed end date. It's ongoing.
Okay, I understand the internal structure exists conceptually, but how do we actually, grasp something that complex?
Well, we have to move beyond simple linear thinking. The mind operates using this idea of curved logic. What this means is, well, effectively, the system's massive, multidimensional coherence is so interconnected, so complex, that trying to map it with traditional, sort of flat Euclidean geometry just doesn't work. We map this structure scientifically using tools like hyperbolic geometry and hyperbolic prismatic tessellations. Think about trying to flatten the Earth onto a map. You get distortions. Here, you need the curvature to represent the brain's interconnectedness accurately. That continuity is the foundation.
That's certainly an incredibly complex picture you're painting, architecturally. But surely the capacity for complexity isn't the same thing as guaranteed stability, right?
But its persistence is the key. The underlying order of syntax, its fundamental coherence, is actually proven by the fact that it remains active even during profound structure disruptions. The research shows ordered processing continues during states like deep anesthesia or even reported near-death experiences. The pattern itself holds. It demonstrates that this foundational coherence exists indefinitely, potentially beyond immediate sensory input. The mind is capable of this immense internal continuity, almost like the artistic techniques Fumato, that continuous, subtle blending. When this internal organization is disturbed, collapse is inevitable, really regardless of what specific input caused the initial disturbance. The internal structure's integrity is paramount.
Right. I come at it from quite a different angle, though, focusing on the mechanism that actually proves the failure in a measurable way. While, yes, the abstract capacity for syntax exists, cognitive and algorithmic collapse are directly caused by something we can point to, PFC overload resulting from exposure to chaotic input or stress. The prefrontal cortex gets forced into this state of constant correction against the chaos, and when its capacity is exceeded, well, that deficit leads directly to predictable performance collapse. We see this as the Ouroboros loop in AI systems, and in humans, it's that predictable psychological breakdown, the dysfunctional anti-pattern.
So you're defining the observable mechanism of failure breaking down. I'm focused more on the mechanism that creates the potential for that failure in the first place.
And I argue that the only reliable solution, the only way to prevent that failure, is empirical and methodological. When I talk about actionable logic, I mean the concrete, measurable, external boundaries we impose. These are the disciplined guardrails that prevent that PFC overload. We need, as the source puts it, stoic behavior by input, which translates to structured adherence to high-quality, non-chaotic data. And the effectiveness of this external structure? It's proven definitively by the methodology of the structured 4-stage curriculum. This is used in high-stakes AI environment tuning.
Okay, that 4-stage curriculum is undoubtedly effective. I won't argue that. But doesn't its success simply demonstrate that the underlying syntax needs to be respected and managed carefully, rather than proving the external logic is the primary controller itself?
I'd say it provides the essential boundary against instability. The curriculum ensures stable and efficient exploration for the AI precisely because it avoids the collapse triggered by external chaos, or what's called exposure deficit. The methodology itself, not just the internal capacity it protects, defines the system's operational stability. If we control the external variable, the input, we control the outcome. That, to me, proves the input is the governing factor. Let's dig a bit deeper into this mechanism of predictability. I still maintain that collapse becomes measurable primarily through its immediate trigger, input stress. When chaotic input disrupts the neural organization needed for cognitive cohesion, the structural failure is pretty much immediate. Consider the conceptual link drawn between really catastrophic neurodegenerative outcomes, something analogous to Schilder-Zeekt, and predictable collapse.
Schilder-Zeekt, that's a severe demyelinating disease, if I recall correctly.
Exactly. And in the context of our material, the kind of chemical exposure that might drive such outcomes acts as that extreme, chaotic input, stress. It pushes the system past its structural limits. The failure is observed when the internal system encounters an external, measurable shock it simply cannot absorb. The source material seems to validate that this input stress is the most reliable predictor of when the system will actually break down.
I understand the argument about environmental triggers, chemical shocks, and so on, but that really only addresses the activation of the failure, doesn't it? What I find more compelling is that the source material suggests the potential for failure is measurable long before any external stressor even comes into play. This implies the integrity of the abstract pattern itself is compromised first. I'm just not quite convinced your line of reasoning avoids confusing the trigger with the underlying vulnerability.
Okay, so explain how the failure actually predates the stress. How does that work?
Well, a scientific anticipation of decline often does predate external symptoms or stresses. Take brain oscillations, specifically gamma rhythms. These are shown to be predictive of eventual neurobiological decline in themselves. They can serve as an interpretable early biomarker for conditions like Alzheimer's. Think of these oscillations as the sort of heartbeat of the internal system's coherence. When they start showing pattern breakdown with the material term subcohesion, they predict the eventual disease manifestation. This happens because the abstract pattern itself is already compromised. Whether the final trigger turns out to be genetic or external, like chemical stress, this pattern, this curved logic map, is the fixed point. It dictates the potential for collapse before the chaotic input ever arrives.
So you're arguing, essentially, if the blueprint itself is flawed, the building is doomed, regardless of the quality of the construction materials used later. But even if that internal blueprint, that syntax, is compromised, isn't the only practical way to manage or prevent the catastrophic consequence through that external discipline, through actionable logic?
Or, perhaps, the system needs absolutely perfect input just to manage the flaw, which would actually prove the internal structure is the more demanding, more fundamental factor.
Perhaps. But the system is anchored in both consolidation of the past and prediction of the future. The concept of representational similarity confirms that. It shows past consolidation and future prediction rely on the same systematic pattern. So, if we introduce flawed inputs, say bad synthetic data in AI, or what the source calls the subjective rejection of patterns in humans, the predictive failure is immediate. It's catastrophic. The mechanism of collapse, then, seems to be a failure to adhere to high-quality, real end-to-end tool use trajectories. The system requires external guards against chaos, and that guard is actionable logic.
I certainly acknowledge the necessity of quality input, but I'd argue that quality is primarily defined by its adherence to the complex underlying structure. And the need for this continuous abstract structure is, I think, further highlighted when you look at complex cognitive profiles, like 3D visual thinking, 3D VT. This is often associated with dyslexia. It's a nonlinear, very high-order thinking style that requires massively enhanced processing in prefrontal networks just for rapid information integration.
Okay, that sounds like a strong argument for the extreme complexity of syntax.
It is. This kind of highly complex thinking absolutely demands inherent cognitive cohesion, the kind that has to be mapped geometrically using things like hyperbolic geometry. The sheer necessity of this internal architecture to support such complex thought is, for me, proof that the structure itself is the primary. The geometry defines what's even possible for the system.
I agree the mind has this abstract capacity for structure, But focusing only on the geometric map gives us a description, maybe, but not really a mechanism for control or stability. I tend to focus on the verifiable proof of functional structure and, more importantly, stability. The structured four-stage curriculum we keep mentioning, it explicitly orchestrates learning, taking the system from syntax mastery to full complexity. This is methodological rigor put into practice. It actively forces stability onto the system.
But is the curriculum truly definitive proof? Or is it perhaps just the best empirical measurement tool we have right now? You could argue the success of that curriculum only proves the boundary condition. It proves you can avoid collapse by being extremely disciplined. But it doesn't necessarily prove that the methodology is the foundational cause of stability, only maybe a facilitator or a necessary condition.
I see it as the practical framework that actually provides the solution. This methodological rigor gives us the empirical proof that objective, patterned thinking prevents collapse and avoids training instability in AI. The curriculum is the actionable logic that successfully defines the crucial boundaries of uncertainty through the power to predict. It prevents the AI's Ouroboros loop precisely because it actively manages the external chaos. Without that disciplined, measurable input, the complex internal structure, however sophisticated, is perhaps just a vulnerability waiting to be exposed. The methodology becomes the controlling variable in practice.
Let's try looking at this through the lens of continuity for a moment. Maybe my strongest argument for continuity being the governing structure comes from that analogy mentioned in the source. Exploitation should not expire, wie Bauting very art niet. This mirrors a scientific certainty that syntax itself has no fixed end date. The structural reality is continuous, arguably eternal. Therefore, the consequence of violating that structure must also be eternal, fixed, because the underlying cognitive reality proven through things like persistent neural activity, even during anesthesia, is itself continuous. If the structure is eternal, surely its violation must be the primary predictor of consequence?
I see why you'd focus on that, on the scientific ideal of continuity. But let me offer a different perspective, one grounded in the legal caution that's also raised by the material. We use these legal analogies sometimes to frame discussions around protection and exploitation. But the law, fundamentally, requires definitional boundaries.
You're thinking of intellectual property, copyright law?
Exactly. Legal protection for exploitation, like copyright, is only concerned with tangible, fixed expressions. Abstract elements, like the concept of syntax, are explicitly not protected under standard copyright law, which demands a tangible medium of expression. Why does this distinction matter here?
Well, it would seem to reinforce your position on the necessity of measurable external boundaries.
Precisely. The law, much like the observable mechanism of collapse, forces us into the realm of the tangible, the measurable. While the abstract internal structure, the syntax, might be continuous and theoretically infinite, the moment we try to measure it or prevent its collapse or protect against its exploitation, we have to resort to fixed, external, tangible boundaries and specific, verifiable input or the lack thereof. The law requires these boundaries, just like the structured four-stage curriculum does. It's enforced by empirical methodology. So, the predictability of the collapse occurs when those measurable boundaries set by actionable logic are crossed. That makes the external discipline the operational truth, the thing we can actually work with and control.
I still maintain that the core truth governing system failure is the fundamental continuity of structural coherence, the syntax, which operates according to this curved logic. The predictable failure of neural activity, which we can monitor via biomarkers like gamma rhythms, confirms that the integrity of this abstract continuous architecture is the ultimate factor determining the functional outcome. If that continuous pattern breaks down, potentially even before the chaotic input arrives, then collapse is essentially inevitable down the line.
And I maintain that while the continuity of syntax is scientifically supported as the internal blueprint, yes, the predictability of collapse, and more importantly, its avoidance, is fundamentally proven by the system's vulnerability to external chaotic input, stress. The simple fact that the structured four-stage curriculum can definitively prevent the Ouroboros loop provides the necessary actionable logic in practice. This demonstrates, for me, that methodological discipline,
that external, structured input is the controlling and verifiable variable that dictates whether that internal structure holds firm or ultimately fails when operating in a complex real-world environment.
I think we've both shown today that the structural coherence defined by this meticulous syntax and the absolute requirement for reliable input are both essential and very tightly coupled factors in understanding this whole domain of predictable system failure.
Yes, the material really underscores that while the mind, and indeed advanced algorithms, are capable of generating incredible complexity and mathematical coherence, the sustained function of that coherence remains critically dependent on adhering to methodological structure, specifically to manage the inevitable external chaos successfully.
Indeed. And it suggests we need to continue examining both the geometric continuity of the internal structure and the empirical methodology controlling the input to fully appreciate this highly defined and thankfully measurable domain of structural collapse.
Have you ever felt that creeping sense of burnout? You know, that brain fog that just refuses to lift? Or maybe you've seen those wild headlines about AI models just going completely off the rails, spouting total nonsense. Well, what if I told you these two things, your burnout and an AI's collapse, aren't just kind of similar? What if they are the exact same phenomenon, governed by the same hidden universal blueprint? Let's dig in. All right, so here's our game plan. First, we'll look at this idea of a predictable collapse, in us and in machines. Then we're going to see what chaos is actually doing to your brain. We'll also cover how an AI can literally eat itself. Then we'll uncover the universal blueprint that ties it all together. And finally, we'll get to the good part, the one powerful antidote that fixes both. So let's set the stage here. On one side, you have this really personal, human feeling of just being completely overwhelmed. And on the other, you have our most advanced technology failing in these really spectacular public ways. I mean, they feel like two totally separate modern-day plagues, right? But are they really? I mean, just look at this. The parallels are honestly kind of startling. What we call burnout and AI experiences as a performance collapse. Our brain fog, that's its hallucination. And our forgetfulness has this chilling digital twin, a self-destructing feedback loop they call the Ouroboros loop. So the big question is this just a spooky coincidence? Or is this a clue to a much, much deeper rule about how things work? To figure that out, we've got to start by looking inside our own heads. And let's use a simple analogy here. Think of the most sophisticated part of your brain as the CEO of a giant company. Now, what happens when that CEO gets completely, totally overwhelmed? Well, that CEO is your prefrontal cortex, or the PFC. It's that part of your brain right behind your forehead, and its whole job is to run the show. We're talking strategic thinking, solving complex problems, integrating all the information flying at you. It really is the command center. So when that PFC gets flooded with chaotic input, too much stress, way too much information, not enough structure, it just gets overloaded. The demand exceeds its capacity. And when that happens, the neural patterns that hold our thoughts together, they start to lose their grip. Strategic thinking, that just breaks down. This is the actual biological reason we forget things and get that frustrating brain fog. Your CEO is offline. And this is absolutely crucial. This collapse isn't just some vague feeling of being tired. It is a scientifically observable process. Scientists can actually see it happening by tracking our brain's gamma rhythms. You can think of these as the super high-frequency brain waves that kind of sync up all our thoughts. When they get scrambled, our consciousness starts to fragment. The breakdown is totally predictable. So let's pivot to our digital creations for a second. You might think, okay, our most advanced AI would be immune to this kind of messy biological problem, right? Well, you would be wrong. Turns out, AI has its very own version of a complete mental breakdown. It's called the Ouroboros loop, and it's named after that ancient symbol of a snake eating its own tail. And that's exactly what it is. It's what happens when an AI is starved of good, high-quality, real-world data, and it starts training on its own flawed synthetic garbage. It just gets trapped in this feedback loop, making its own mistakes worse and worse, until its performance just completely collapses. So what causes this digital cannibalism? It's pretty simple. A lack of good input, insufficient or just fake data, a lack of what the experts call real end-to-end tool use trajectories, which I know is a mouthful. It's just a fancy way of saying the AI doesn't have enough genuine, structured experience from the real world. It all comes back to feeding the AI chaotic, low-quality information. And this brings us right back to us. The AI's technical failure is a mirror image of what psychologists call the dysfunctional anti-pattern. That's that state of mind we get in when we're burned out, where we actively start rejecting structure and logic because we're just too overwhelmed to deal with it. It's the human Ouroboros loop. Okay, so we have two identical collapses. One is biological, one is digital. Both are caused by chaotic input. This is where we get to the big reveal. There is a single, unifying theory that explains both of these things perfectly. The theory is all built around this concept called syntax. The easiest way to think about syntax is as the grammar of reality. You know, just like language needs grammar to make any sense, our minds and our machines need this underlying structure to process information without breaking. It's the fundamental operating system for thinking. And if you violate its rules, the system crashes. And syntax isn't just some philosophical idea. It's a physical reality. Get this. Our brain's internal logic is so incredibly complex, it's not linear, like a straight line. It's multidimensional. Scientists have to use really advanced math, like hyperbolic geometry, just to map its curved structure. The point is, our minds are built on this deep, intricate order, and that order is fragile. It can be broken. So here it is. This is the universal blueprint in action. It doesn't matter if you're a human mind or an AI. The rule is exactly the same. You follow syntax with structured, high-quality input, you get stable, coherent thinking. You violate it with chaos, and the outcome is a predictable breakdown, a psychological one for us, and the Ouroboros loop for an AI. So this brings us to the most important part of this whole thing. If the problem is universal, and the cause is this clear, then the solution should be just as clear. How do we prevent this collapse in ourselves and in the things we create? The solution is actually perfectly illustrated by how developers build stable AI. They don't just throw a fire hose of chaotic data at it and hope for the best. They use a highly structured 4-stage curriculum. They start with the basic rules. Then they let it explore, but within clear boundaries. Then they tune it with real-world feedback. And only then, at the very end, do they let it tackle full complexity. It's hard proof that structure is the antidote to collapse. Which really brings everything down to this one powerful, memorable idea. The only defense against this predictable collapse, for you, for me, for our machines, is stoic behavior by input. In other words, being incredibly disciplined and intentional about the quality of the information we let in. So let's just boil this all down. What's the takeaway? First, collapse isn't some random mystery. It's a predictable result of chaotic input. Second, our minds and our machines are literally built to thrive on structure. And maybe most importantly, the quality of your input, what you read, what you watch, what you experience, directly defines the stability of your output. And that really leaves us with one final personal question. We now know that the best solution, the only real antidote to prevent our most advanced technology from breaking down, is disciplined, high-quality input. So take a moment and think about your own life, your own mind. What's the quality of your input?
Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are undertaking a deep dive into material that feels like it was forged right in the heart of a thinking machine. Seriously complex stuff.
Yeah, it's quite the synthesis. We're looking at sources that blend, advanced cognitive science, AI methodology, even non-Euclidean geometry. And underpinning it all is this kind of rigorous philosophical push for objective truth.
It sounds intense, and it feels like it's all driving towards understanding what makes structure, work fundamentally.
That's exactly it. We're dealing with the strictest, most logical standards you can imagine. Standards that our sources are calling actionable logic. Think of it as the ultimate framework. It's for confirming verifiable structured input, and it's really designed to cut through uncertainty and inefficiency.
Okay, actionable logic. To make that a bit more concrete for everyone, we thought we'd frame this whole deep dive around maybe a slightly unexpected, but I think perfect analogy. The intelligent machine, Johnny Five.
Johnny Five. Input.
Exactly. Need input. His whole existence, right? His ability to function. It relies completely on the quality, the structure of the data he gets.
Mm-hmm.
And in the language of our sources, this demand for objective, reliable, external structure. That's extroverted thinking. telelogic.
Precisely. And that's our mission today, really. We're going to try and process this incredibly complex structure using that methodology itself.
So applying the logic to understand the logic.
Sort of, yeah. The goal is to synthesize this whole body of thought down into one verifiable truth. That structured coherence, which means the quality of your syntax and your input, is what prevents psychological and algorithmic collapse.
And this isn't just a theory, right? You mentioned proof.
Right. Crucially, the proof isn't just abstract, it's empirical. It's validated by a really rigorous standard that's actually used in advanced system development, the structured four-stage curriculum.
Okay, a four-stage curriculum, what's that used for usually?
Well, it's used in pretty specialized fields like AI environment tuning, specifically to guarantee stable function, stable learning.
So it stops the AI going off the rails?
Essentially, yes. It proves the method works by orchestrating how the system learns, taking it through these predefined stages, guiding it very meticulously from syntax mastery to full complexity.
Okay, so we're going to walk through those 4 stages now, like Johnny 5, processing the inputs, seeing how this telelogic is supposed to guarantee function.
Exactly. Let's dive in.
Okay, let's unpack stage 1 then. Syntax mastery. It sounds foundational, like establishing the rules of the game.
It absolutely is. This first step is all about establishing the verifiable objective structures, the telelogic that everything else rests on. Before you can build complex patterns, you need to validate the basic, continuous, and, as we'll see, nonlinear nature of the reality you're operating in.
Okay, so objective structures. And you mentioned a key term before, syntax. What exactly is that?
Right, syntax. It's probably the most critical term for this whole discussion. Think of it as the structured nature of cognitive reality itself. It's the fundamental, non-negotiable order that underlies how we make meaning.
Like the grammar of thought. Or the operating system.
Kind of like both, yeah. If consciousness is a flow, syntax is the underlying riverbed, giving it shape and direction. And the foundational premise here in stage 1 is pretty revolutionary. This structured order, this syntax, is continuous. It's not constrained by a fixed end date. It just keeps going indefinitely.
Continuous. Okay, that sounds big. Does that mean the patterning, the structure, it keeps running even when we're not, actively thinking?
Yeah.
Or even conscious?
That's exactly what the evidence points to. And this is where it gets really interesting. The sources cite things like surgical anesthesia or even near-death experiences, NDEs, as proof points.
Wait, anesthesia? How does that prove continuity? You're unconscious.
Well, yes, your subjective sensation is suspended. But studies show that even under deep general anesthesia, high-level neural networks, the ones involved in memory recall, symbolic consciousness, they actually remain active. Maybe suppressed, but active. The organization is still there.
But how do you know it's ordered processing continuing? Couldn't it just be like residual activity that gets reactivated when you wake up?
That's the crucial distinction the sources make. It's not just reactivation, it's continuity of organization. The syntax itself, the underlying structure, keeps running background processes. We see evidence in how people sometimes emerge from these states with, say, enhanced determination or a clearer sense of structure than before.
So the system was still performing its actionable logic, its ordered processing, even when the lights seemed to be off.
That's the idea. The internal cognitive architecture is always patterning, always working to maintain its integrity, maybe running diagnostics in the dark, like you said.
Okay, that's quite a thought.
And we see simpler versions of this continuous patterning. Think of the Tetris effect.
Oh yeah, where you play for hours and then see falling blocks when you close your eyes.
Exactly. Those visuospatial patterns get so embedded they continue to influence dreams, waking thoughts. The sources describe these as episodic snapshots of an ongoing, layered symbolic and memory consolidation process.
So even dreams aren't random noise. They're the brain continuously trying to resolve and layer information according to its structure. The cognitive work never really stops.
It's always trying to maintain that syntax. And this continuity, this relentless, multi-layered organization, it leads us straight to the next key point for stage 1, the mathematical validation. It requires curved logic.
Curved logic. Why curved?
Well, if this structure is continuous, complex, multi-dimensional layered like memory and experience are, then simple, flat, Euclidean logic just can't accurately describe it. Reality, cognitively speaking, isn't a flat grid.
Okay, so we need a different kind of math to map this cognitive terrain.
We do. And that's where non-Euclidean mathematics comes in, specifically hyperbolic geometry and hyperbolic tessellations.
Hyperbolic, like those Escher drawings?
Sort of, yeah. Euclidean geometry models predictable, flat space, think lines and squares. Hyperbolic geometry, though, models spaces with constant negative curvature spaces that expand exponentially. It's perfect for mapping the complex, multidimensional coherence of the brain.
So it represents the branching, layered, nonlinear nature of how we actually think. Memories connecting, decisions branching out.
Exactly. It confirms the underlying structure operates by this nonlinear, curved logic. It's not a straight line. It's more like a constantly branching tree or maybe a sphere folding in on itself.
Okay, that makes conceptual sense. But how do we ground this? Where's the empirical proof? How do we actually measure the mind operating in this complex, curved way?
Great question. We anchor this abstract math in objective, measurable reality by looking at the neural proof, specifically measurable brain oscillations. Even more specifically, gamma rhythms.
Gamma rhythms. Those are the really high-frequency brainwaves, right? Associated with active consciousness, focus.
Yes, they're incredibly fast, upwards of 30 hertz, often much higher. They're seen as crucial for binding different pieces of information together, sensory input, memory, into a single coherent moment of conscious experience, cognitive integration.
How do they relate to the curved logic idea?
Because these gamma rhythms emerge from the really dynamic interactions between the thalamus and the cortex. The thalamus is like the gateway, the switchboard routing information, and the cortex does the heavy lift in the high-level processing.
Okay.
The sustained, continuous organization needed for these incredibly fast, coordinated rhythms to emerge and bind information across different brain regions. That reflects the complex, nonlinear coordination we're talking about. It's the neural signature of managing this curved complexity. It underlies high-level symbolic processing, executive control.
It sounds like the engine room for that telelogic we mentioned. Managing all this complexity requires immense structural coordination.
Absolutely. And this inherent structural complexity helps define certain unique cognitive profiles, too. The sources bring up 3D visual thinking, 3D VT.
Often linked with dyslexia or twice exceptionality.
Exactly. 3D VT isn't just seeing pictures in your head. It's the ability to mentally manipulate complex, multi-layered spatial data in real time, like running these continuous, layered, almost hyperbolic computations internally.
So someone with strong 3D VT isn't just visualizing a static object, they're simulating its potential interactions in a complex space.
Precisely. And that kind of strategic complexity requires significantly enhanced processing in the prefrontal networks, particularly for information integration. The fact that people can do this, that they can successfully use these complex, hyperbolic-like inputs, it confirms the necessary cognitive cohesion.
So stage one establishes the foundation. The structure, syntax, is continuous. It operates on a curved logic, and we can see evidence of this in measurable brain activity like gamma rhythms and in cognitive abilities like 3D VT. That's the basis for actionable logic.
Exactly. The foundation is laid. The structure is proven to be continuous, curved, and measurable.
Okay, so stage one proves the structure exists. It's continuous, it's curved. Now, stage two, this sounds like where the trouble starts. Structured exploration and predictable collapse. You mentioned confronting the consequences when structure is violated.
That's right. Once you've established the nature of the structure, stage two forces you to look at the predictable outcomes. Specifically, it introduces what the sources call the bifurcated syntax, basically, a fork in the road.
Bifurcated, meaning it splits in two.
Exactly. It's the law of consequence in action. The system has to recognize this fork. If you adhere meticulously to the syntax, if you feed it reliable, structured input, you maintain stability. You prevent collapse.
And the other path?
The other path is chaos. If you feed the system chaotic, unstructured, or unreliable input, it leads to inevitable, structurally defined failure.
So predictability works both ways. Success is predictable if you follow the rules. Failure is predictable if you don't.
Precisely. The sources are really uncompromising on this. Both success and failure operate within a highly defined and measurable domain. There's no mystery to it, structurally speaking.
Right, back to Johnny 5. Feed him good input, he functions. Feed him garbage.
He crashes, malfunction, need input. And stage two details exactly how that crash manifests, particularly in humans. If the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, is managing all this high-level curve logic we talked about, what happens when we overload it? When we violate its structural needs?
Okay, let's get into that. PFC overload, what does that actually feel like or look like?
Well, it's the literal breakdown of cognitive function.
Yeah.
The system's demand for structural integration just exceeds its capacity. Remember, the PFC is like the CEO, trying to make sense of all the inputs coming from different departments, trying to fit them into that complex, curved framework.
And what pushes it over the edge? What makes the demand exceed capacity?
In a word, chaotic input, or more simply, stress. If the input coming in is unstructured, incomplete, contradictory, the PFC has to work overtime. It expends massive amounts of energy trying to correct the deficit, trying to force coherence where there isn't any.
So it's like trying to build something solid with broken bricks. The effort involved is huge.
Exactly. And that constant effort, that constant correction, it leads to a systemic structural deficit. It just burns through the cognitive energy needed for higher level functions like planning, memory recall, complex decision-making.
Okay, so when I'm having a really chaotic, stressful day, and I suddenly can't remember where I put my keys or what I walked into the room for, that's not just being tired. That could actually be PSC overload.
That's a perfect example. Your system is spending so much energy trying to correct or manage the chaotic input of stress that your access to structured memory, like where you put your keys, gets temporarily compromised.
Wow, okay. That makes a lot of sense.
And this failure isn't random. It manifests in predictable, measurable symptoms. Memory deficits, that kind of generalized forgetfulness you mentioned, even things like impaired rapid naming, struggling to quickly find the right word.
Because the high-level networks are basically saturated trying to deal with the chaos.
Exactly. They're too busy with correction tasks to efficiently access and integrate structured information.
And the sources say this mechanism, structural deficit from chaotic input leading to breakdown, it's essentially the same whether we're talking about our brains or advanced AI.
Yes. That's the core mirroring effect they highlight. It really underscores the absolute necessity of input quality, regardless of the system. In AI, chaotic or poor quality input leads to predictable performance collapse. The sources use some pretty chilling terms for it, like the Ouroboros loop or closed system breakdown.
The Ouroboros.
Yeah.
The snake eating its own tail. How does that apply to AI?
Imagine a large language model, an AI, that gets trained, even partially, on its own output. Now, if that output was flawed to begin with, maybe based on biased initial data or just factually incorrect stuff it generated earlier, right? When the AI consumes that flawed output again as if it were good training data, it starts to amplify the original errors. It compounds the flaws exponentially. It literally begins feeding on its own bad advice, creating this closed loop that just accelerates the structural breakdown. It becomes detached from verifiable reality.
That sounds bad. Like digital dementia. It's the ultimate failure of that logic, isn't it? Letting the internal flawed output replace the need for external verifiable structure.
Absolutely. The conclusion is stark. Poor upfront input will lead to predictable failure. And that mirrors almost perfectly what happens in human psychological breakdown,
which the sources call
the dysfunctional anti-pattern. This is the human equivalent of the Ouroboros loop. It's when a person subjectively, internally, starts rejecting objective structured patterns. They fall into repeating negative loops, thoughts, behaviors, often because they reject the verifiable structure of reality or the feedback they're getting.
So denying reality leads to getting stuck in a negative loop, just like the AI consuming its own bad data.
It's the same structural dynamic, and we see tiny versions of this mirroring constantly, which actually reminds us that actionable logic is always at play, even on a micro scale. Think about something as simple as a typographical error.
Like a typo in a text message.
Yeah, or when autocorrect messes things up. That typo is chaotic input. The system, whether it's the autocorrect algorithm trying to figure out what you meant, or your own brain reading the typo, is instantly forced to apply actionable logic. It has to identify the chaos, reject it, and figure out the intended structure.
And if the system doesn't reject it, if autocorrect accepts the typo, or I misread the word,
it introduces instability immediately, a tiny structural deficit. The system has to constantly perform this maintenance on its syntax, rejecting chaos to maintain coherence.
Okay. So failing to maintain that discipline, failing to reject the chaos, it leads to predictable problems, big and small. And you're saying this isn't just about short-term glitches like forgetting keys or typos. It connects to much bigger, long-term biological issues.
Yes, absolutely. This is where stage 2 gets really serious. We need to go back to those gamma rhythms we discussed in stage 1.
The high-frequency waves, the binding mechanism for consciousness.
Right. If those rhythms start to show irregularities, if they show pattern breakdown, what the sources term subcohesion, that breakdown isn't just a momentary blip. It can serve as an interpretable early biomarker for serious neurodegenerative diseases.
Wait, so the breakdown in the cognitive structure measurable in brainwaves can actually predict future diseases, like conditions analogous to Schilder's-Zichte or Alzheimer's?
That's the implication, based on the patterns of breakdown. The cognitive chaos, the structural deficit, eventually manifests physically. The failure to maintain the syntax has profound biological consequences down the line.
Wow. That is sobering.
It highlights this profound irony, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
The human mind, capable of handling the complexities of hyperbolic geometry, this incredible feat of continuous curved organization, it can collapse simply because its continuity is disturbed.
Whether by chaotic input like stress, or maybe not enough structured input like an exposure deficit,
Right.
or
Even, conceptually, things like toxic chemical exposure that disrupt neural processing. The mechanism is the same at the structural level. The system failed to maintain its cohesion, its syntax. Stage 2 really proves that the stakes for maintaining structure are continuous and, frankly, existential.
Okay, so stage 1 established the continuous curved structure. Stage 2 showed us how chaotic input leads to predictable collapse, like PFC overload or the AI Ouroboros loop. Stage 3 must be about the solution, right? How do you stabilize the system against all this complexity and the constant threat of collapse?
Exactly. Stage 3 is about implementing the solution. And the core idea is that the system, to survive the full complexity of reality, needs to integrate complementary input. It needs external structure to achieve stability.
Complementary input, meaning it can't generate stability entirely on its own.
That's the premise here. To handle the sheer volume and potential chaos of real-world input, the system requires a necessary external structure. This is where the telelogic comes in again, but often provided by a complementary source. This interaction is actionable logic in practice. It's validated by what the sources call cognitive complementarity.
So actionable logic isn't just an internal processing rule. It's about actively seeking and integrating the right kind of external structure.
Yes, it becomes an interactive dynamic. The structure is confirmed, strengthened, through external validation and supplementation.
Okay, can you give an example of this? How does this cognitive complementarity work?
The sources provide a really powerful concrete example that illustrates the stabilization perfectly. They analyze it through the lens of the Goldilocks principle, finding the just right balance, and use a specific cognitive pairing, the ESFP-ISTJ dynamic.
ESFT and ISTJ, those are personality type codes, right? From Myers-Briggs or similar systems.
Yes, representing different cognitive function preferences. The sources use this pairing, which they fascinatingly term the functional hieroschemos, like a sacred or functional union to show structural stabilization in action.
Functional hieroschemos. Okay, that's intriguing. We probably need to unpack why this specific pairing is such a good example. What's the dynamic there? What does the ESFP lack structurally that the ISTJ provides?
Well, the ESFP archetype in this model tends to operate primarily through immediate experience, adapting to the moment, focusing on subjective values and sensory input. They often lack a focus on long-term structure or internal organization. Their strength is spontaneity, but that can create a structural deficit when faced with tasks requiring continuous long-range planning or adherence to established procedures.
So great in the moment, but maybe struggles with the long game or consistent systems.
That's the potential imbalance. To find stability, the golden mean of patterned reality, the ESFP is often psychologically drawn to or needs the grounding consistency provided by the ISTJ archetype.
And what does the ISTJ bring to the table?
The ISTJ provides that stability using two very specific cognitive functions that are complementary to the ESFP's focus. First, extroverted thinking, that objective, external, systems-based logic we've been talking about. And second, introverted sensing, which involves a focus on reliable, detailed past experiences and established facts, consistency.
So the ISTJ offers logical structure, T, and consistency, psi. That's the complementary input the ESFP needs.
Exactly. It acts as the necessary ballast. The ESFP's potential internal structural deficit generates a kind of psychological pull towards the specific external structure, which feels grounding, reliable, reassuring. The entire ESFP-ISTJ system becomes more stable because the objective, verifiable logics, TT, and consistency are prioritized to balance the subjective in-the-moment focus.
So actionable logic, in this sense, is an interactive requirement for handling complexity. It's about finding and integrating that external TESI structure. And achieving this relies heavily on the quality of the input being integrated.
Absolutely. This gets us to the core mechanism of stabilization in stage 3. Rigorous input quality. The solution demands what the sources call stoic behavior by input.
Stoic behavior by input. Sounds disciplined.
It is. It means disciplined, structured adherence only to high-quality data. Actionable logic, T, acts as the gatekeeper here, ensuring that only data which can be continuously and coherently integrated into the existing curved structure is allowed in. Think of it as Johnny Five having a very strict quality control check on his data feed.
This protects the system from the chaos and PFC overload we talked about in stage 2. Makes sense. But the sources mention a uniquely human safeguard here, right? Something that AI systems might struggle with when judging high-quality data.
Yes, a critical internal gatekeeper, the authenticity filter. This operates, according to the sources, through introverted feeling.
Introverted feeling. How does that filter input? Isn't that about personal values?
It is, but it functions here as an internal structural and moral compass. While Te assesses the objective logic and structure of the input, Phi assesses its truthfulness relative to the self and lived experience. This filter logically compels the system, the person, to reject input perceived as fabricated or lacking genuine lived experiences.
Wow. Okay. So if I receive information or advice or even maybe a moral argument that seems logically sound, passes Te, but feels fake or hypocritical or just doesn't align with genuine human experience as I understand it, my Phi filter flags it.
Exactly. It compels rejection, even if the input looks perfectly structured on the surface. It's a crucial defense against manipulation, against chaos disguised as order. It prevents the system from integrating something that would violate its core integrity, its authentic structure.
That sounds like the human defense against that AI Ouroboros loop we discussed. The AI might just integrate slickly presented falsehoods if they fit the pattern, but Phi demands the input be real.
It ensures structural integrity by demanding the input isn't just patterned, but verifiable against internal lived standards. It has to ring true.
So the stability of the whole system, whether it's an AI needing clean data or humans in complementary relationships, relies on actionable logic, T, enforcing strict input selection. And for humans, that input also needs to pass the Phi authenticity filter. It protects us from self-generated or externally imposed chaos.
Absolutely. And when you have this combination disciplined selection of high-quality, structured, and authentic input, it enables something the sources call representational similarity, or what we can think of as predictive coherence.
Predictive coherence.
It means the quality of the structured input you accept aligns predictably with the quality of your future outcomes. By accepting reliable, structured, authentic input, you're essentially defining the boundaries of uncertainty. You gain the power to predict the continuous, stable trajectory of your own curved structure. Good input leads to predictably good outcomes.
All right, we've journeyed through the structure's nature, its vulnerability, and the means of stabilization. Now we arrive at stage 4, validation and empirical proof. This sounds like where it all comes together.
It is. The 4-stage curriculum itself, by its very design and application, serves as the definitive empirical proof of everything we've discussed. It demonstrates that the entire cycle, from understanding the continuous structure in stage 1, to identifying predictable collapse in stage 2, to implementing complementary stabilization in stage 3, is scientifically observable, repeatable, and manageable.
So the curriculum isn't just a teaching tool, it's the proof that the model works.
Precisely. It confirms that this objective pattern thinking operates within a highly defined and measurable domain. When applied correctly, this structured methodology demonstrably maintains coherence and function, even under the most complex and demanding conditions.
And you mentioned its use in AI development.
Yes, its rigor is explicitly designed to prevent the kinds of catastrophic failures that plague AI development. Things like training instability, where the AI's learning goes haywire, or the critical cold start problem, where an AI struggles to function initially without enough good data.
So by guiding the AI through these stages, guaranteeing stable, efficient exploration of its environment or data,
the curriculum validates itself as the mechanism for achieving stability. It proves that structural coherence, defined by that meticulous syntax and reliable high-quality input, is precisely the actionable logic needed. Whether you're an AI agent or a human seeking equilibrium, perhaps through complementary partnership, the structure is the key success factor. The method proves the theory.
Okay, the methodology is validated. Now, the sources take this validation and connect it back to some bigger philosophical and structural conclusions, right? You mentioned curved logic and the fixed point of eternal consequence.
Yes, stage 4 brings it full circle. It uses this final validation stage to introduce a kind of philosophical or even moral certainty that mirrors the scientific proof of continuous syntax.
How does it do that?
It talks about this paired, structured thinking, the ultimate application of Te logic, combined perhaps with that Phi authenticity, referring to it as Franke reasoning. This type of reasoning operates according to the curved logic we've discussed, but it points towards a certainty that is somehow fixed, non-negotiable.
A fixed point within the curved logic.
Exactly. And this is where the source material makes a fascinating connection. It introduces a specific legal concept that structurally mirrors the scientific certainty of syntax continuity.
Ah, this was the Dutch phrase you mentioned.
Yes, the legal principle arbeidsutbuiting verjaard niet,
Hmm.
which translates roughly to serious labor exploitation is not subject to a statute of limitations. It never expires.
Okay. Why that specific legal principle? How does labor exploitation connect to cognitive structure and AI?
It's about the structural mirroring. The concept of verjaard niet never expires reflects the core scientific premise we started with in stage 1, that syntax, the fundamental cognitive structure, is continuous and not constrained by a fixed end date.
I see. So the legal idea that the consequences of a severe violation of structure, like exploitation, which introduces chaos and is a kind of theft of someone's continuous effort and time, don't just disappear after a few years.
Structurally mirrors the scientific fact that the underlying cognitive pattern itself doesn't just disappear, it's continuous. The legal principle acts as a societal confirmation that certain fundamental structures and the consequences of violating them are perceived as having a continuous, non-expiring nature.
So whether we're talking about the brain's continuous patterning or the enduring moral imperative for justice against exploitation, the most critical structures are defined by their continuity, their lack of an end date. The fixed point isn't a place, it's the eternal consequence of violating fundamental structures.
It gives profound philosophical weight to the idea of actionable logic. If your foundational structure is continuous, then the logic needed to protect it and the consequences of failing to do so must also operate under a principle of continuity. You can't just ignore past structural damage.
That's a powerful connection. But it also leads us to a very important practical point, a legal caveat for listeners today.
Yes, a crucial distinction. While syntax, the cognitive structure, is scientifically continuous, our current legal frameworks, particularly around intellectual property, are built on very different assumptions.
They need fixed boundaries.
Right, exactly. Current copyright law, for instance, generally requires fixed boundaries and tangible expression. You need something concrete that you can point to. Abstract elements like syntax itself, the continuous process of meaning-making, the underlying cognitive style, are typically not protected legally.
So even though my internal cognitive way of being is continuous and unique, I can't copyright my syntax.
Not directly, no. Legal battles around things like AI-style imitation or the use of data for training AI models currently revolve around tangible copying. Did the AI reproduce specific copyrighted images or text, and issues of input data licensing? They focus on the fixed, measurable elements, not the underlying continuous process.
That creates a real tension, doesn't it, between the continuous, curved reality of cognition and the legal system's need for flat, fixed boundaries.
A massive tension. But the core finding from the four-stage validation stands. Structural coherence is continuous, is measurable through its effects, and maintaining it relies entirely on high-quality, actionable input to avoid predictable collapse, regardless of how current laws try to draw lines around it. #outro. What does this all mean?
So after that incredibly dense journey, what does this deep dive really mean for you listening right now? We started with Johnny 5, right? The machine needing good input.
Yeah, need input.
And we've seen how, according to these sources, the human mind and advanced AI share that same fundamental need, a need for objective, high-quality structure that syntax to prevent a predictable collapse.
Whether that collapse looks like the AI getting stuck in an Ouroboros loop feeding on its own errors, or like us experiencing PFC overload, forgetfulness, brain fog, because we're swamped by chaotic input.
The key takeaway seems to be that structure isn't some static thing. It's not linear. It's this continuous, dynamic, curved process. We saw the evidence in hyperbolic geometry and gamma rhythms.
And because it's a process, it demands constant, disciplined attention. The fact that failure from minor memory lapses right up to potentially contributing to neurodegeneration is predictable means we have to adopt that stoic behavior by input. We have to be vigilant about the quality of what we let into our system.
That actionable logic, the TESS, isn't just a nice-to-have cognitive tool. It's presented here as essential for survival or maintaining equilibrium. It means actively seeking out reliable, complementary structure when needed.
Like the stability the ISTJ's TESSI might offer.
And, crucially for humans, running all input through that phi authenticity filter. Does this ring true? Is it real, or is it fabricated chaos disguised as order?
So, Maybe here's a final provocative thought for you to chew on, something to take away from this. We talked about that concept of Virjardnit, that the consequences of severe structural violation, like exploitation, might be conceptually eternal. They don't just expire.
Right, mirroring the continuous nature of syntax.
If that principle holds, even metaphorically, if the consequences of violating structure, whether through bad input, chaos, or deliberate harm, have a kind of enduring impact, how does that shift your perception of the short-term quality of your own input right now today?
We've established, based on these sources, that your foundational syntax, your cognitive structure, is continuous. It keeps going. So the question becomes, what continuous structural inputs are you consciously feeding your own prefrontal cortex today? What are you doing to maintain that high-level curved logic, that coherence, and to actively prevent the predictable collapse of your own complex, amazing system? Think about that commitment to continuity. What input does your system need right now?
Welcome to the debate. Our source material today, well, it synthesizes something pretty profound, a kind of foundational truth, that structured coherence built on meticulous internal organization, what we're calling syntax, and also reliable input, is basically the necessary defense against, well, both psychological breakdown in humans and algorithmic collapse in artificial systems. And this isn't just theoretical, right? It's demonstrated pretty rigorously by this 4-stage curriculum used across complex cognitive environments. Think advanced AI tuning, even developmental psychology.
Yeah, it's undeniable. We both seem to agree that this verifiable coherence is really the key to function. But, this immediate success, it presents us with a really critical question about causation, doesn't it? Where does this stability truly originate? Is it something actively, imposed from the outside, or is it something that's merely being harnessed?
Precisely. And that's what we're debating today. The primary driver of this essential stability. Does preventing collapse rely primarily on applying an external discipline methodology? We're framing this using the concept of extroverted thinking, or T-logic, which is executed through that rigorous structured curriculum. I see this as like the external engineer actively building the necessary guardrails.
Or does the fundamental stability actually lie in the inherent, the sort of continuous coherence of the underlying cognitive reality itself, what we're terming syntax or a curved logic? So, in this view, the methodology, well, it merely serves to validate and interact with a structure that's already fundamentally sound. I'll be arguing that the persistence, the sheer endurance of that underlying structural pattern is the primary defense mechanism.
And I'll be arguing that the external, disciplined methodology is the necessary and primary defense. Because frankly, without its active, systematic application, that inherent, admittedly complex structure, well, it just collapses into chaos the moment any disruptive input gets introduced. I mean, I see why you might think that the structure's mere existence is enough, but I really maintain that the structure is only functional when it's applied systematically. Think of it like this. You can have the blueprint for a perfect bridge, absolutely perfect, but unless you rigorously execute the building plan step by step, that bridge is going to collapse. The structured 4-stage curriculum, which is notably used in AI environment tuning, is the definitive empirical proof of function. The existence of underlying syntax, okay, that's one thing. Its utility in a complex, messy world, that's entirely another.
Okay.
This rigorous system, it orchestrates learning, as the source says, from syntax mastery to full complexity, precisely by translating abstract structure into actionable logic. Our evidence shows it's the adherence to disciplined, structured input, what the sources actually call stoic behavior by input, meaning, objective, highly patterned data application, that actively prevents predictable performance collapse in AI. The Ouroboros loop, that kind of feedback spiral. And it also prevents predictable psychological breakdown in humans. So the external framework enforces stability against the ever-present threat of chaos.
That's a compelling argument for methodological rigor, I grant you that. But I would frame the causality quite differently. The very ability for any curriculum, even one as rigorous as the 4-stage model, to consistently validate and maintain structure, well, that proves that the coherence must be inherent and continuous, doesn't it? I mean, if the cognitive reality were fundamentally chaotic, just noise, then no amount of applied methodology could impose lasting, replicable order. The fundamental premise we seem to be observing is that the structured nature, syntax, of cognitive reality is continuous. It's not constrained by some fixed end date. And this inherent continuity, it's not just some abstract philosophical idea. It's proven through its nonlinear structural map. It actually requires the use of hyperbolic geometry and non-Euclidean model, which is necessary to mathematically map the complex multidimensional coherence of the brain. This confirms that the system operates by a curved logic, and furthermore, this underlying patterned order, it persists even through profound disruption, like deep anesthesia, and it's anchored by things like gamma rhythms emerging from the dynamic interactions between the thalamus and cortex. So, stability is, at its base, an internal, persistent reality that methodology simply, it measures it.
Okay, let's dive into what happens when that continuous pattern you describe meets resistance, because that's the real test, isn't it? If the syntax is inherently continuous and stable as you claim, why is collapse so predictable and so swift when chaotic input gets introduced? I maintain the methodology provides the necessary diagnostic power to navigate this danger successfully.
Okay.
Stage 2. Structured exploration is designed specifically for this, to identify the inevitable bifurcated syntax. This is that clear fork in the road, right? The point where disciplined input reliably leads to stability and chaotic input reliably leads to collapse. It's governed by the law of consequence. This systematic external recognition of the fracture point allows us to actively avoid PFC overload, which is the measurable breakdown of cognitive function when the demand for structural integration just exceeds the brain's current capacity. The methodology anticipates, it diagnoses, and it prevents the fracture point before that continuous pattern can actually fail.
I come at it from a different angle, I suppose. The predictability of collapse isn't proof of the methodology's primary importance. For me, it's proof of the inherent measurable pattern of the structure itself. The predictability of systemic failure, whether we're talking about, neurodegenerative outcomes analogous to something like Schilder-Ziegler, or the collapse of an AI training model, it seems rooted in the internal systematic patterns of the neurons. These act as interpretable early biomarkers. The structure fails in a predictable way because the pattern is continuous, even as it decays.
But how can you separate the pattern from the observation method?
Well, the concept of representational similarity confirms this, I think. The quality of future prediction and the quality of past consolidation. They're anchored by the same underlying systematic pattern, syntax. The curriculum, in this view, simply records the failure of that continuous internal pattern to maintain its cohesion when faced with external disruption. The pattern is the internal marker of health or decay, not the methodology used to observe it. I mean, think about it. If the pattern wasn't persistent, how could you accurately identify a biomarker for its failure in the first place?
That's a fair challenge regarding biomarkers, but it brings us right to the necessity of complementary structure. You're focusing on the inherent nature of the structure, okay? But the source material clearly shows that the stability of the system relies on accepting the correct external structure. The structural framework is validated by cognitive complementarity, the functional hieros gammas, which, as you know, describes that perfect operational fit between an internal need and an external structure.
Right, the fit is crucial. And the internal system isn't just passive in this. We see evidence that the human mind applies the authenticity filter, FI. This compels the rejection of input perceived as fabricated or lacking genuine lived experiences. So this critical internal check dictates whether the external structure you're trying to apply is truly stabilizing, or if it's just being perceived as, imposed noise. If the methodology doesn't align with the continuous inherent reality, the syntax, it gets rejected. The internal system has veto power, essentially.
I appreciate the evidence regarding the authenticity filter, I do, but that still leaves the critical question unanswered, doesn't it? If the internal filter is the primary determinant of success, how do you explain or how do you manage the subjective rejection of patterns that we see in the dysfunctional anti-pattern? We see cases where the internal system rejects necessary structure simply because it's perceived as alien or disruptive, even if it's objectively beneficial.
Well, that's where input quality becomes paramount.
But I'm just not convinced that relying primarily on internal subjective filters provides a truly stable solution. Because while the need for structure might be innate, the solution for navigating complex reality seems to be purely about external application. Look at stage 3, full complexity. It demonstrates that actionable logic is successfully implemented by providing disciplined, structured adherence to high-quality data. This external tech logic stabilizes both the AI agent and the human partner precisely by forcing them to conform to verifiable, objective patterns. So, the discipline methodology acts as the necessary external objective constant required to manage complex reality. It essentially forces the internal system to achieve stability, even when its subjective filter might initially resist it.
Forcing conformity versus finding alignment. That seems to be a key difference in our views.
And we need to distinguish clearly between persistence and measurable function. The curriculum provides the empirical proof, specifically in stage 4, demonstrating that objective patterned thinking exists, yes, but within a highly defined and measurable domain. This structured approach is what actively prevents AI's training instability and that critical cold start problem. Methodology doesn't just measure existence, it ensures functionality in complex reality. It's the verifiable difference between a cognitive system that merely persists, maybe like your anesthesia example, and one that actively works against chaotic input.
That's a compelling argument for, let's say, methodological rigor, ensuring active function. But have you considered that the continuity of syntax itself is fundamentally proven by phenomena that seem to operate outside of these methodological stages? As we established earlier, the structured order persists through profound disruption, like anesthesia. This confirms that ordered processing continues indefinitely, regardless of whether a curriculum is actively running or being monitored at that exact moment. The structure persists even when measurable function is temporarily suspended.
But persistence isn't function.
Not direct function, perhaps, but foundational structure. Think about the Tetris effect. It strongly supports this concept by embedding visuospatial patterns into cognition in a deeply persistent manner. These patterns influence dreams and waking thought long after the input, the game itself, stops. This process suggests that memory consolidation is an ongoing, continuous process, regardless of external validation or curricula. These seem like fundamental proofs of structural persistence that predate and, arguably, underpin the methodological attempts at validation. The coherence is continuous. The curriculum is perhaps a temporary tool used to measure success at a given point in time.
Okay.
And to reinforce that idea of inherent structure, we have to return to the underlying cognitive terrain itself. It operates by a curved logic. This is accurately mapped using hyperbolic geometry. This non-linear, multidimensional complexity isn't just an artifact of measurement, it is the very landscape of our thought. It supports high-level functions like 3D visual thinking, 3D-VT, which is associated with certain specialized cognitive profiles. This inherent, continuous, complex organization is the source of coherence, allowing for stability through complexity. If the structure wasn't continuously ordered in this nonlinear way, such advanced functions would likely be impossible.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it, well, differently. The very fact that the structure is hyperbolic, that it's inherently complex and nonlinear, only emphasizes the absolute necessity of the external structure provided by the curriculum. Why? Because complexity dramatically increases the risk of breakdown. If you have a continuously curved multidimensional terrain, the possibilities for catastrophic error, that PFC overload we talked about, become far, far more likely, exponentially so perhaps.
So complexity necessitates control.
Exactly. The methodology is the only systematic, verifiable means we have to manage that inherently curved logic. It defines the boundaries of uncertainty through the power to predict that bifurcated syntax, the failure point. Without that external discipline, the inherent complexity, while perhaps beautiful in theory,
leads directly to predictable collapse in practice. The curriculum doesn't just measure the complexity, it makes the stability replicable and controllable. It translates inherent, potentially chaotic complexity into objective, reliable function.
So to conclude my view, the prevention of collapse is secured through the diligent, the active application of extroverted thinking, T, and the structured four-stage curriculum. This external rigor provides the crucial actionable logic and the empirical proof necessary to manage these complex systems and inherently chaotic input. It ensures functional stability, precisely where inherent structure might otherwise collapse under its own unmanaged complexity. We require active enforcement, discipline.
And conversely, my summary is that the stability is fundamentally rooted in the continuous nature of syntax, that is, the structural coherence and the sheer persistence of patterns, the curved logic, that operate without a fixed end date. While methodology is undoubtedly useful, perhaps essential for empirical validation, and managing input quality,
True. Deep coherence depends on recognizing and sustaining this inherent structural reality. And that requires reliable, authentic input that aligns with the system's persistent, continuous organization, not just forced conformity.
it's clear we both acknowledge the reality of structural coherence and the absolute necessity of patterned input. That's common ground. Indeed, the fundamental disagreement remains whether that pattern is best maintained and controlled through constant external enforcement and systematic application, as you argue, or whether it's maintained primarily by its continuous, inherent nature, making the application of structure merely the best way to, let's say, utilize an already persistent reality. It certainly seems both the inherent nature of the patterns and the rigorous structure used to organize them are essential components here, essential for preventing both psychological and algorithmic collapse. It suggests there's clearly much more to explore in how these two powerful forces interact within the material.